Welcome to the Mushoku Tensei Season 2 Part 2 Supercut. From Rudy's wedding to Paul's tragic fate and everything in between, here's all the cut details from episode 37 onward. Season 2 Part 2 starts right where we left it. Rudy had just been cured of his impotence, and his proposal to Sylvie meant marriage was right around the corner for him. What this means for some of you, though, is that as much as you don't want to admit it, you're pretty much watching a romance slice of life right now. It's a point in Rudy's life where things are relatively peaceful, and his main focus is to support Sylvie whatever way he can. There was a bit left out with regards to how Rudy approached his current situation with Paul, but as far as cut content goes, the majority of it's relevant to the wedding and house. I mean, there was an entire section of the novel dedicated to its renovation, part of which included a complete repurposing of the secret room in the basement. So, as we take a look at that and the deeper mystery behind the original owner of the house, perhaps you'll find there was more to this episode than just Rudy's home life. Let's get started. Episode 37, My Dream Home, covering chapters 1 to 4 from volume 10 of the light novel. It was only once a month that Rudy and the others ever had to go to homeroom, and it just so happened that the day he was cured was the day before said homeroom. So, with a strut in his step and a weight lifted off his shoulders, Rudy would attend bearing a scent so incredibly strong that Linnea and Prasenna would actually have to plug their noses from it. We only saw the first part of their deliberation after, since in the novels the two went on into a serious discussion on who would become the boss's woman. It was a conversation Rudy initially thought they were having just to make fun of him, but after Prasenna stepped up as the one to take one for the team, Rudy knew he needed to put an end to it. Still, Prasenna would go and sit unusually close to him, and Linnea would stay far away as if to keep herself guarded. It was a weird sight since the two were acting completely opposite from how they usually did. In any case, it was once Rudy revealed that he'd finally been cured that everyone would stand up, clap their hands, and say congratulations to him. The sight was so incredibly peculiar yet familiar that Rudy couldn't help but relate it to the last episode of a certain TV anime. A word-for-word reference that I'm certain points towards Evangelion. That wasn't the only reference that should have been made this episode though, since a couple more were made during his conversation with Nanahoshi. Before we get to that though, it was while on his way to her that even Vice Principal Genius would take note of Rudy's new demeanor. He would inquire as to why it is Rudy seemed so different, and Rudy would respond by saying a 3-year problem had finally resolved itself. This made Genius ask whether Rudy would continue to stay at the university, since the whole reason he'd even enrolled here was to find a cure for his impotence. With that now done and his personal mission complete though, Rudy thought perhaps now was a good time to finally head to the Beggarid continent. It was after all the place where his family was. It was when he considered everything he'd be leaving behind though that Rudy began to hesitate, since so much had happened in the past year. He'd reunited with Xanaba and adopted Julie, bonded with Cliff and befriended the two Beast Girls, then even met someone who was isekai just like him. Sylvie was of course what mattered most to him, but she probably wasn't the reason the man God sent him here. If he had to guess, Rudy believed it was also he could meet Nanahoshi. He felt their meeting was more than just a coincidence. That being the case, there was probably something important he was meant to find out with her. It wouldn't be the reason he'd stay here at the university though, since wherever Sylvie was, that's where he would go. This was the decision Rudy decided to follow through with. That didn't mean he'd go running to Asura if Sylvie did too, but it was certainly a possibility should the right circumstances be met. Like, one of the core reasons he didn't feel comfortable going anywhere was simply due to the fact that Paul hadn't yet responded to him. Until he got confirmation of the way things were on his end, Rudy would wait at the university just in case. To go anywhere else would mean he would miss Paul's reply, and that could be risky if something dangerous had happened. So, until he could touch base with Paul, Rudy was set to continue being a student. Now, it was during his conversation with Nanahoshi that the generational gap between them would be made apparent, specifically through the use of manga and anime references. What I mean is that, since the two never really had much to talk about, it was in the times they did that Rudy would try to find some middle ground. He would try to take advantage of their shared passion for manga and light novels. It was when he made a reference to Sailor Moon though that the blank stare he was met with highlighted their age gap. You see, not only did Nanahoshi have no idea what Sailor Moon was, but the follow-up reference involving Dragon Ball was something she'd only ever heard of. This was pretty surprising from a self-proclaimed avid reader, but when you consider how she was 17 and him 34, it was only natural the series they've read to be completely different. There was a complete gap in their ages that made conversation incredibly difficult. a generational difference that was only further accentuated by the 10-year gap between her arrival and his. This was why Rudy just blurted out the question about dating, since with nothing else to talk about, it was the only thing he could say. Now, one of the things Rudy thought about when recounting the quarrel with Nanahoshi was the potential of her running some sort of reverse harem, and the high likelihood that the two she was with were isekai'd as well. The lack of rumors made such a chance equally unlikely, but then again, to survive without mana would be, well, difficult. Unless you were lucky like how Nanahoshi was, to be thrown into this world with no support and no mana was essentially a death sentence. It was a thought that Rudy quickly realized Nanahoshi must go through daily. Moving on to the cafeteria now. Despite Rudy being excited for his upcoming marriage, he still wasn't sure if it was appropriate considering the current situation with his family. That didn't really bother him too much though, since whenever it did, he would just think about all the amazing things getting married came with. So in actuality, the only real problem was the method in which marriages happened here. He'd never seen one himself, and since the one for Paul and Lilia was just a massive party, he couldn't say for sure what even went into the ceremonial part of a marriage. In fact, Rudy wasn't even sure if people had one here. So Rudy would go and ask both Zanaba and Cliff, but in addition to neither mentioning a ceremony whatsoever, both would also give wildly different answers dependent to their culture. In Shirane, the man had to send gifts to the family of the bride, while in Milis the bride was given a dowry to provide to her husband. Both emphasized a strong connection between the families, but neither had any particular type of event behind it. Even Zanaba, who'd already been married and divorced, couldn't provide insight other than the house stuff. Cliff also couldn't provide insight into Elvish customs, since in addition to Alina Lise not being the most, well, traditional, he had also promised the two wouldn't get married until he cured her. So the most either could offer was financial assistance from Zanaba's side. He was more than capable of buying any house no matter how big, and was happy to do so should Rudy request of him. Of course, Rudy didn't want to accept, but considering he had no idea what the current housing market was like, he decided to keep the option as a backup just in case. Fast forward to when he's actually looking at houses, and the place he was at was pretty much a real estate agency. Technically, it's referred to as the Land Management Office, but since their main purpose was the purchase and sale of vacant property, along with the occasional permit grants for empty plot builds, it made sense to just consider them the real estate agency. Normally, such tasks were handled by the region's liege lord, but with Sharia not having a regional lord at all, the duty was instead handled by the Magicians Guild and 3 magic nations. They had worked together to create the Land Management Office and established it as its own independent group capable of distributing land without them. This would be who Rudy was dealing with, and it was here he would come across all sorts of homes he definitely couldn't afford right now. Sure, he could get a decent house or a relatively nice apartment, but anything posh was way out of the budget for him. Asking Sylphie was something we saw him consider too, but if he wanted to look dependent and fulfill his duty as the man, Rudy felt he needed to do this alone. That's when he saw the cursed manor at the bottom of the listings, and the entire backstory for that was given by the real estate agent. So we already know who went in and who got murdered, but if you're wondering why the Adventurers Guild stopped trying to cleanse it, the main reason was because the quest for it was stuck at the E rank. It was definitely far more dangerous than the E rank, but with not enough funds to raise the quest's rank beyond that, the Land Management Office found they couldn't make an enticing enough offer for anyone to take it, especially since there was a bit of discord between them and the Adventurers Guild. Rudy would then ask if he could get it for free if he cleansed it himself, but the moment he did, the agent just looked at him as if he was crazy. He would then sign a provisional contract instead and list Ariel and Bodygotti as the guarantors for it. It was as soon as the agent saw whose names were on the paper that he would immediately stand up and go get his manager. Rudy couldn't be certain which of these names was getting him the special treatment, but it was clear one of them for sure made him someone important. Enough that in the subsequent negotiation with the manager, Rudy was able to bring the asking price down by half. This brings us now to Rudy's initial investigation, and despite the building being over 100 years old, it looks surprisingly well maintained given how long it's been abandoned for. It made Rudy think perhaps some kind of mana was infused into it, perhaps a type of mana which protected it from decay. This wasn't far-fetched considering that literally anything could be infused with mana, but as we find out later, a lot of the house's good condition was attributed to the doll. In any case, the 3 would investigate using a formation Rudy came up with himself. Zanaba would stick in front and be their tank, Cliff the middle since he was the most important, and Rudy the back as the tactician and DPS specialist. The reason I say Cliff is the most important is because it was only natural to protect the healer. Sure, he could provide a bit of divine offensive magic too, but what mattered most was keeping him safe as their support. Zanaba's weapon was one Rudy had actually crafted himself, since as Zanaba himself once said, normal weapons were simply too fragile. What I mean is that his superhuman strength always made him break them. This would mean replacing them would become quite expensive, so rather than do that, Rudy simply made his own for him. As for Cliff, his nervous demeanor reminded Rudy he had actually just come back from an adventure, one that he was genuinely curious to hear all about. Just in case you don't remember though, it was back towards the end of Season 2 Part 1 that Cliff would go adventuring with Alina Lise and the S-Rank party's stepped leader. Cliff wasn't so excited to tell him about it though, since apparently the entire time they just ripped into him. It was an awful experience Rudy was sure wasn't that bad, but for someone like Cliff it probably was. As a person who constantly proclaims themselves a genius, to be constantly criticized was probably quite the shock to him. It's likely he didn't know how to handle such an intense and hostile environment. Now, there wasn't anything peculiar during the investigation in the anime, but what Rudy found odd in the novels was the way the fireplace was set up. He couldn't pinpoint what it was that made it seem so weird, but there was definitely something about it which made it special. Rudy would then have Cliff investigate it for any magical markings, and sure enough there was a magic circle imprinted right on the inside of it. He didn't know what exactly that magic circle did, but a good assumption was that it helped to heat the entire house. You see, if this fireplace truly was a magical implement like how Rudy thought it was, then it probably served as a furnace bringing heat to all the rooms. It would be a significant stroke of luck if so, since a tool like that was extremely expensive. The next rooms didn't have anything as peculiar as that, but Rudy did get caught up imagining how Sylphie would be in each of them. In fact, the more he saw, the more his imagination ran wild at all the possibilities of what their home life would be like. So altogether, the main floor had 2 kitchens, 2 large rooms, 4 small rooms, and 2 toilets, making it seem like the entire thing was 2 houses connected into one. With the upper floor being 2 symmetrical wings connected to 1 massive bedroom, it really was more than enough for whatever fantasies Rudy envisioned for himself, of which there were certainly many. Now, it was as Cliff worried for Alina Lise and Zanaba Julie that Rudy too would wonder if Sylphie was waiting up for him. He did mention how he was going out, but not once did he say he was spending the night. This made him worry that Sylphie was waiting outside his room for him to get back, and that in turn made him want to run back to the university and leave a note for her. With the sun setting and night almost here though, by the time he did and got back, there was a chance Zanaba and Cliff would have gotten themselves killed. He was after all the leader of their party, and if anything happened to them, it would be his fault. This made him reconsider the severity of leaving Sylphie in the dark, but at the same time led to what he knew was a dangerous mentality. What I mean is that if he justified the situation by saying it was only just this once, then who's to say how many more just this onces would come after it? It was a slippery slope that tended to accumulate, and one he knew would ultimately lead to a rift between them. This was something he really wanted to avoid, so the only solution he could come up with was to raise his own death flag. Thus the reason why he made this statement here to Zanaba. It wasn't something that was explained in the anime, but the only reason he said it was to force a trope on himself. A death flag he instantly regretted the moment he raised it. In fact, with the way Zanaba responded and the way he reacted, Rudy felt if he took it any further he wouldn't even make it to his wedding. His death flag would have been so ridiculously high that he wouldn't have been surprised if a bullet came out of nowhere and killed him right here. It was all a funny bit of subtext that made this conversation a bit more light. The investigation at night proceeded pretty much as we saw, but if you're wondering why it is Rudy's stone cannon didn't affect it, the main reason is because he had weakened it. He knew anything stronger would damage the house, and out of concern for doing damage which couldn't be repaired, Rudy weakened his projectiles right at the last moment, resulting in the attack only staggering the doll. Now, we saw Rudy's applications for it reach all the way to silicone, but what he didn't mention were the others in between all that. Like, he knew inanimate objects such as armor could move the same way that this doll did, but if that could also be applied to his own stone figures too, then the possibilities awaiting him truly were endless. It was when Rudy discovered the book in the basement after this that something about it just seemed super familiar. You see, from some memory or the other, both the crest and script were something he knew he'd seen before. The fact the text was one he couldn't read, though, indicated the language it was written in was either Sea God tongue or Sky God tongue. That or a completely different language he'd never even seen before. Whatever it was that was being researched here, though, was clearly forbidden and abruptly halted. It was the only explanation for the routine the doll seemed to be taking every night. Rudy figured it was the magical implement responsible for keeping the house in the condition it was in. As for who it was who made it, well, there were a whole number of reasons for why they just suddenly up and vanished one day. The only thing Rudy knew for sure was that whatever it was enough to cause them to leave their work behind. There's a bit more to who this potential person could be, and that comes with 2 weeks of cut content revolving around the house's renovations. A few days were taken to ensure no other robots were left, then a skilled dwarven craftsman was hired to make everything presentable. He was a 30-year veteran that went by the name of Balda the Hammer, a friend of Talhand whose achievements were known across the continents. He was introduced to Rudy through Elena Lise, and the two would take on this project of turning this ruin into a proper domicile. As it turns out, the whole thing was just a 3-part process consisting of the door, washing area, and basement. The rest were just a bunch of touch-ups that didn't require much work at all. One of the observations Balda had made about the house in general, though, was that aside from the floors, everything else was made rather poorly. From what he could tell during the brief tour Rudy had given him, it was as if the house was made solely to hide the basement. To him, the basement was the part crafted the best, then everything else was clearly just extra. A quick construction project only done as an afterthought. Fortunately, the stairs, kitchen, dining area, and fireplace were all solid work too, but whatever talented builder worked to create all that clearly didn't do anything to assist with the renovations of the walls and ceiling. It was evident that this was where construction went haywire. This is where things start to get a bit more interesting, since upon closer inspection, Balda was able to spot a crest of sorts. You see, right on the fireplace which Rudy discovered was a magical implement was a similar emblem to the one he found on the book down in the basement. Balda recognized it as the mark of a genius craftsman, but unfortunately the name of said craftsman was supposedly lost to time. That said, any magical implement which bore his crest was always sold for a lot since they were the best on the market. This was another stroke of luck for Rudy, since an implement this big was incredibly rare. More importantly than that, though, was the fact that these implements were here meant that the original owner of the house likely built them here, making it probable he was the same person as that genius craftsman. I'm not sure if any of this information will end up being important later, but what is what Rudy decided to do with the basement. We don't know for sure what it is he decided to do, but it was strange enough to get quite the comment from Balda. Something about Rudy clearly not being a follower of Millis. Machinery and materials were then brought in after, and the secret room in the basement was finally transformed. This would be the last thing before Rudy would finally bring Sylphie, and that brings us now to the end of the episode. Episode 38, Wedding Reception, covering chapters 5 to 7 from volume 10 of the light novel. The first and most important thing that needs to be mentioned is exactly what it is Rudy decided to do with the secret room down in the basement. Last episode I mentioned it wasn't specified, but after reading a little more, it was confirmed to be a shrine. A private room home to a secret altar, the contents of which were the idols Rudy went and prayed to every day. It was kept behind a door Rudy ensured was soundproof, so no matter how many times he went in or out, no one would suspect there was something else down in the basement. Now, it was a week after all these renovations had been completed that Rudy and Sylphie were able to spend some quality time together. Normally, Sylphie wouldn't have had time to do any of this, but after getting a week off thanks to Ariel, the two would spend all week together preparing for their upcoming reception. It was a week Rudy had hoped would be filled with all sorts of romantic endeavors, but was instead non-stop work as arrangement after arrangement had to be made. Some of the concerns that weren't mentioned in the anime was the way certain people would react when seeing others, the seating order since there was a mix of people from royalty to adventurers, then of course the possibility that no one would even show up. This last one stemmed from a fear he gained from an anime, and it was a reference to this scene from Kyojin no Hoshi. Basically, the main character put all this work into setting up a Christmas party, but when the time came, no one he invited showed up. It's not really all that important, but a reference like this once again highlights that generational gap between him and Nanahoshi. We're shown yet again through media the type of content Rudy grew up with. As for the other concerns, consideration needed to be given for how certain people may interact with each other. Like, with Linnea and Persenna having bad blood with Ariel, who knows how they would react when they see her again? And knowing exactly how Ariel was, it's likely she would use this reception as her own personal networking event. There was no way she would miss an opportunity to make acquaintance with the other special students. Seating was a whole nother issue on its own because when your guests are royalty, nobility, adventurers, and slaves, you couldn't possibly seat them in order of status properly, especially if you wanted to keep groups like Zanaba and Julie together. So rather than make the mistake of seating someone with lower status ahead of someone with higher status, Rudy instead just opted for no seating at all. It was the best way to circumvent the whole issue with status. It's also the reason he instructed everyone to come in uniform, since while there was definitely a gap in status, it wouldn't be as apparent if everyone came dressed the same. They had even went and bought one for Julie. This is just one of the many things they left out on Julie's end, and as you'll soon see, they're all brief scenes of her acting cute. Switching back to the preparations first though, although the anime doesn't make it visible with Rudy's design, shopping for a new robe was actually quite essential for him. This is the same robe he's been traveling with ever since the Demon Continent, and while Sylvie herself didn't care that it was in tatters, the people Rudy associated with likely did. So it wasn't so much Sylvie wanting to make Rudy look less disheveled, but rather a necessity for if he wanted to be part of Ariel's camp now. Sylvie would maintain her Fitz identity as she walked into the store, and this would be the reason why the shop owner had recognized her. It was a place Ariel and Luke came to as regulars, and that made it clear it was a shop that catered to Asuran royalty. Luke actually came here more than Ariel did, and every time he did, there would always be a different girl with him. Now, there was actually purpose behind each of these robes, and both catered to the elemental specialties Rudy had mentioned earlier. For water, this was made from the hide of rainforest lizard, and that was a material that was supposed to be highly water resistant. For earth, this was made from the hide of Begarit's great earthworms, and they were supposedly durable in sandstorms. The reason Rudy decided not to take either though was because his experience with rainforest lizards proved they weren't that resistant to water at all, and the camo of the desert one just seemed out of place here. Had it been something a bit more snow-like, then this second robe was a purchase he would have made for sure. As for the last, this was a more subdued design typically chosen by older people. It was made from the hide of the D-rank lucky rat, and this was a superior species to that of the mucky rat. Only once had Rudy ever come across either of these monsters, but it was when he did that he was terrified of them. Something about a horde of 20-inch rats just didn't sit well with him, especially when the lucky rat was even bigger than that. Luckily, their skin boasted resistance to acid and poison, so in general the robe was quite the useful one. You just had to look past the price tag making it equivalent to a house in the Demon Continent, then after that the robe really was rather nice for him. So the measurements for that would then be taken, and the robe handcrafted and delivered within the next 3 days. The two would then proceed with the rest of their shopping, and it's here they would have that conversation about Rudy not thinking he was good enough for her. Of course, Sylvie reassured him that he was, but if there was anything he could improve on, it would be his confidence. You see, Sylvie believed Rudy could be a bit too submissive sometimes, so in an effort to make him less, she straight up told him to be more assertive. It's an important line that I think highlights how it is Sylvie sees Rudy right now. Though she always pictures him on this unattainable pedestal, he's not a perfect entity she's afraid to criticize. No, he's simply the person she wants to support the most in life. This would then bring us to the bath scene, and while there was a whole section on Rudy teaching Sylvie how to bathe properly, there wasn't anything too important in between all that. It would simply remind them of how it was the first time they met, and the two would reminisce on how they ended up together. Rudy would also show his appreciation for bathing in general, since while he never really got around to it in his past life, he found doing it now was actually quite relaxing. Sylvie would also take the occasional peek at Rudy, and the rest was Rudy practicing self-control. Now, it's when we get to the wedding reception a few days after that there were a whole bunch of interactions cut which developed the side characters. These brief yet interesting moments which I found added charm to a lot of them. The first came from Linnea and Persenna, and it was through their early arrival 2 hours before the event was even scheduled to start. You see, for them this was a display of loyalty. As it is in beastfolk culture, when attending a wedding it was customary to go hunting the morning of, make a kill, then offer said kill as the gift. The earlier one went hunting, made their kill, then returned with it, were all measures of respect for the person who invited them. So for Linnea and Persenna to show up 2 hours early, all with this massive boar they had hunted just this morning, well, that was a tremendous display of their loyalty. It was them showing Rudy how much they truly respected him. It was 1 hour later that Zanaba and Julie would arrive, then 30 minutes after Ariel and her attendants. They were introduced as Elmoy Bluewolf and Cleanne Elrond, and the two were surprisingly close to Sylvie despite us never having seen them before. In fact, When everyone was conversing later on in the party, Rudy could actually spot Elomoy in tears as she spoke about how happy she was for Sylphie. It was clear she and Cleanne really cared for her, especially when you remember the three probably fought numerous battles together. Rudy would then make a joke about people having last names combining a color and an animal, then Ariel would step forward and present the gifts she'd brought. The first was an aphrodisiac Rudy was more than familiar with, then the next was a wooden dildo for in case Rudy couldn't do his job anymore. They were both presented in the most serious manner you could imagine, and that was because in Asura stuff like that was completely normal. For a nation as promiscuous as theirs, it makes sense for gifts like these to be part of their culture. It's actually something that I briefly talked about back in my episode 0 cut content from almost a year ago. In any case, Rudy would guide Ariel into the common area where a bit of tension would build between her and the Beast Girls. Obviously neither were gonna start a fight, but Rudy made sure by giving Linnea and Persenna the look. He would even glance at Zanaba in order to tell him to keep those two in check, but Zanaba instead took that as an invitation to introduce himself, a display of refined social skills which reminded Rudy that he too was royalty. Of course, he didn't go very long without praising Rudy, but that was par for the course when it came to any conversation with him. It was Cliff, Elena-Lise, and Nanahoshi who showed up last, and to Rudy's surprise they had all arrived together. Nanahoshi didn't actually walk with them, but she was hovering outside the gates looking all flustered. Naturally, Elena-Lise urged her to come with them, and that was how the three ended up showing up together. It was when Cliff heard that Nanahoshi was Silent 7th Star that he would immediately go and introduce himself. For some reason, he wanted to know whether she had heard of him. Probably to inflate his ego, and that's exactly what had happened when she responded saying she did. Nanahoshi would then go and speak to Rudy, and she would basically confirm that he was serious. If there was any doubt in him not wanting to go back to Earth, then it was all pretty much gone with this marriage here. Elena-Lise and Cliff would then head straight into the common area, and the two wouldn't hesitate to converse with anyone. Despite Elena-Lise's status being just above that of Julie's, it was clear that such a thing meant nothing to her. She had no problem interacting with anyone whatever way she wanted, leading Rudy to think perhaps the notion of rank meant nothing to elves. The same couldn't be said for Cliff though, since while I'm sure he was aware of what status meant to everyone, he had no problem stifling the mood preaching about how great he was. Of course, Elena-Lise made it a bit more bearable, but just like Zanaba and his praise for Rudy, this too was just part of who he was as a person, even if it did come off as direct rather than endearing. Nanahoshi was a lot more social than you may think, since while the anime showed her tucked away in the corner, she did make conversation whenever someone approached her. It wasn't anything deep or important, but she wasn't just this wallflower actively avoiding everyone, especially later on when Julie and Bodygotti join her. Since we're on the topic of Bodygotti now, his arrival was standard behavior for pretty much every Demon King. As it is according to their culture, whenever a Demon King attends a party, they must always wait for the perfect moment to astonish and disrupt. It was a silly custom created by Kashirika herself, one she made up completely on a whim, yet one Bodygotti still followed despite knowing it was ridiculous. In the novel, he had come through the back door like some kind of robber, while in the manga he straight up came through the chimney like he was Santa Claus. Obviously that's a little ridiculous for someone his size, but it's definitely hilarious to see him crawling out like this. Now, it was after the speech and a little more socialization that a few minor interactions were omitted from the after party. Julie would sit next to Nanahoshi and eat chips without saying anything, then Bodygotti would come up after and join both of them. Whether it was because Bodygotti was intimidating or she just wanted to protect her chips, out of pure instinct Nanahoshi would pull out one of her rings. She was clearly in a panic as this massive figure approached her. Bodygotti wasn't going to do anything, but he did mess up her hair as he casually played around with both of them. This would spur Nanahoshi to leave and go talk to Rudy, which in turn brings us to that important question Sylphie had asked to her. An interesting comment I'm surprised they didn't show along with it was another line from Sylphie stating that she knew Nanahoshi wasn't from here. The reason I say I'm surprised is because the inclusion of it adds a whole nother layer to this. You see, if Sylphie knows Nanahoshi's from a different world, then her initial question means she suspects Rudy might be from one too. This is the first time such a topic has ever been mentioned by someone close to him, so it leads to a perspective of Rudy that we haven't yet seen before. One in which we get to see how he treats the idea of other people knowing he's, well, different. So, after Sylphie had asked the question of what she meant, Nanahoshi would glance at Rudy as if to ask what to do. She had left it entirely up to him since for her such a detail wasn't hers to tell. Rudy's response may not be what you expect, since for him, he honestly didn't care what Nanahoshi said. Whether she told the truth or just brushed it off, the fact he was isekai'd wasn't something he was trying to hide from Sylphie. He thought the topic would be a bit difficult to explain, but her knowing it wasn't that big of a deal for him. If anything, it's more important for us as the viewer, since the reveal of such knowledge suggests she already suspects it. At the very least, it presents the concept of being isekai'd as common knowledge. Well, as it would seem for Nanahoshi's case anyway. This brings us now to Alina Lise and Sylphie, which was done surprisingly well considering the amount of information packed within. The majority of it was captured almost perfectly, but for a bit more context, you should definitely check out the manga. An entire side chapter was dedicated to explaining it. Well, at least hinting towards it, since the only hint before that was the one from episode 4. So, it was in chapter 79.5 that Alamoy had gone and done an investigation on Rudy and Alina Lise. It was from this that Sylphie first heard she was part of the Black Wolf Fang, and it was that revelation which made her remember a conversation she once had. The conversation where her father first spoke about her grandmother. So, what the anime and novel portrayed as Sylphie simply telling Alina Lise was instead shown as a flashback between her and Laws. What makes this so interesting is that, in addition to all the stuff about how Alina Lise was a troublemaker, we also get to see how it was Laws found out about her through Paul. Before that, he didn't like Alina Lise too much either, but after hearing how she was while she traveled with Paul, such amazing stories made him think that perhaps she changed a bit. The person Paul described was far different from the outcast everyone else did. It was a different perspective that made Laws think perhaps her and Sylphie should meet one day. It was this conversation which stuck with Sylphie over the years, and that would be the reason why she was even aware of Alina Lise. So, the reception would take a bit of a somber turn here, but with Bodygotti constantly laughing in the background, he alone would keep the mood light. Not once did he come up to congratulate Rudy or Sylphie, but his lively presence was something Rudy was grateful for. Now, it was once people started to leave that the only other notable interaction was between Nanahoshi and Luke. As you'd expect from someone as womanizing as him, it was only natural for him to try and hit on Nanahoshi at least once that day. He was feigning interest in topics he thought she might be passionate about, but no attempt at conversation could dissuade his annoying presence. So the more Luke spoke, the more Nanahoshi got annoyed, and eventually she would have to run to the bathroom just to escape him. That's when she figured it was time to leave, and the rest was pretty much as we saw. This brings us now to the duel between Luke and Rudy, but with the reception wrapping up and Sylphie talking to Alina Lise, the duel was an idea Ariel made clear came from Luke. I know the anime made it seem like it was for all their sakes, but in actuality it was mainly something that Luke wanted. It was his request from the very beginning and something he informed Ariel he desired even before the wedding reception. Now, naturally a duel like this could never be perceived as just for fun, since the weapons being used were both extremely lethal. Like, Luke's double-edged blade meant he wasn't going to be attacking with any blunt side, and Rudy's stone sword meant his attacks would carry quite a bit of weight to them. That may not sound very dangerous for Rudy's case, but after swinging this dense sword every day for hundreds of thousands of practice swings, Rudy knew if he hit someone in the wrong spot with it, it could definitely prove to be fatal. That was just how dangerous the impact of it was. It was thick, heavy, and durable to the point that you probably shouldn't hit someone with it, especially not for something that was supposedly just for fun. Ariel wasn't too bothered by Rudy's warning though, since in addition to this being something Luke asked for himself, he was also going in fully knowing he could die from it. Should the worst come to pass, then Luke was ready to accept both injury and death. Whatever the outcome, he was more than ready for it. This was something Ariel was fully aware of, and she made sure to tell Rudy and even let him know he could beat Luke senseless if he wanted to. This obviously wasn't very reassuring for Rudy, since with him being just an average swordsman and Luke, well, the royal guard of a princess, Rudy was certain there was going to be this insurmountable gap between them. This would then spur Ariel to give a complete description of how strong Luke really was, and on paper he seems actually pretty scary. So he's intermediate in Sword God style and beginner in Water God, then has several magic items making him even stronger than that. His sword is enhanced to cut through shields as easy as butter, then his boots imbued with magic to enhance his speed. His cloak blocks heat, making him fire resistant, and his gloves increase his strength to make his strikes stronger and faster. Beneath all that is clothing described as swordproof, so all in all he was pretty kitted. It was like facing a legendary hero minus the hero part. A pay-to-win gamer who was only just a casual player. Gear like this was known to be so incredibly expensive that even if Rudy sold his newly renovated house, he still wouldn't have enough money to pay for all of it. It was information he probably could have done without, since hearing all about it made him think that he would be the one getting beat senseless. Once again, Ariel would reassure Rudy he'd be fine, but just in case he still didn't believe her, she would give him one last option to provide him comfort. Should he ever feel like his life was in danger, then and only then would Ariel allow him to use his magic. Of course, that didn't provide safety to Luke, but once again that was a risk he was willing to take. Now, it was even with that Rudy would still be hesitant, so that's when Luke himself would step up in order to change that. It was that single line we saw him say in the anime, in addition to an unfair remark questioning Rudy's manhood. He basically said if Rudy was a man he'd understand, which to Rudy was complete nonsense he felt he'd never understand. Obviously he couldn't say he didn't, so in an effort to make it seem like he did, Rudy would reluctantly accept the duel, feeling like he'd just been cheated in some way. He didn't like the idea of Luke questioning his manhood like this. I mean, he had essentially called him out, saying that if he didn't accept, then he wasn't a real man. So, Rudy would have no choice but to accept, but as a precautionary measure to ensure neither him nor Luke would die from it, he would activate his demon eye and use its foresight. The two would then ready themselves only 3 steps apart, making it so in only one step either would be in striking distance. It was a tighter gap than what Rudy usually practiced with, but one he wasn't going to panic over since, well, how serious could this be? He would have no idea why this was happening even up to the moments right before the fight. Rudy would then tell Cliff to get his healing magic ready, and Ariel would commence the fight shortly after that. It's here that I wish the anime added a little bit more to it, since while they did show how Luke was completely outmatched, they didn't truly express just how much he was. What I mean is that the instant the match had started, Rudy was taken aback by just how slow Luke was. It's not that Luke was slow compared to the average person, but when you consider who it was Rudy had trained with and fought before, for some Luke was a whole entire universe behind. He was nowhere near the level of Eris and Ruijerd, galaxies apart from the oppressive Orsted, then even a whole step behind that of Soldat. If he had to compare Luke to anyone, the closest person he could think of was Linnea. She was about the same speed as him even with his items, and that made predicting his movements extremely easy. Luke's form wasn't anything special either, since while it was technically correct, his slow movements made any variations in them easily counterable. So to Rudy he was essentially fighting someone normal for once, a knight whose skills may be superior amongst his peers but is completely manageable when compared to the true monsters out there. This allowed Rudy to counter with a simple arm chop, which was a basic sword god skill he'd practiced over and over. It was a move he'd repeated over 100,000 times, resulting in the very act of it being ingrained into his body. The heavy blow would then break Luke's arm right on impact, and before he could even switch to his other arm, Rudy would kick him in the chest and send him flying. The fight was over and Rudy the victor. Rudy honestly couldn't believe how easy the match was, and he even went so far as to call it a joke. I mean, with so many other swordsmen out there who could beat him even with his magic, to so easily beat one without was quite the surprise for him. So much so that Rudy knew he didn't even need his demon eye. Sure, the fight would have gone on a little bit longer without it, but the outcome would have been the same given how basic Luke's attacks were. So Ariel was absolutely right when she said that Luke was no match for him. This brings us now to the question of why, and while the obvious answer is because Luke was testing him, the true answer was something more akin to Luke's pride on the matter. As Ariel herself said in the anime, because her and Luke loved Sylphie as a precious companion, it was only natural they want to make sure the person they're leaving her with is the right one. It was when Ariel brought up her duty after this that she made sure to emphasize the likely outcome was death. You see, as much as she wanted to believe that she could take the throne, to die trying was far more probable than actually succeeding right now. Rudy wondered why she didn't just abandon all that, but for Ariel this duty went beyond her life. It was to honor the memories of all those who died to get her this far. So, to leave that behind and stay here in Rinoa was the same thing as to betray all those who'd helped her get here. She knew this privilege came with responsibility, and it was that unwavering conviction which Rudy really resonated with. To see her so resolute on the path that she'd set out for herself convinced Rudy that she actually would be a great ruler. The problem with a mindset like that though was that despite Sylphie having nothing to do with it, her unshakable bond with Ariel made her part of it now. Even if she wasn't bound to Asura the same way Ariel was, she was however bound to the bond that she'd formed with Ariel. Rudy honestly had no trouble understanding why that was, because if Richard got up one day and said he was gonna fight Laplace, Rudy knew he would join him even if it did mean certain death. It's not necessarily the greatest comparison, but it does capture the idea of wanting to fight for your friends. That's just how important close bonds like that were. Naturally, Rudy would try to stop her if he knew the fight wasn't one she could win, but knowing Sylphie and knowing how selfless she was, it was probably easier just to join her. That's when Ariel would threaten to take Sylphie back, and she would basically say how there were other methods in which she could do so. Sure, she couldn't beat Rudy in terms of raw power, but when you've been in the game as long as she has, there were definitely other ways to get around that. Ariel would then leave shortly after, and it was then and there that Rudy thought, this is someone I want to be there for. It didn't matter what Ariel wanted or where it was, because when the day came, Rudy knew he and Sylphie were going to be there for her. Rudy would then go back inside, and it was after Sylphie had heard about the duel that she would thank Rudy for going easy on Luke. She wasn't remotely concerned that Rudy had just been in a fight, but was instead grateful that Rudy had spared him. She knew Rudy could have killed him if he wanted to, and it was the fact that he didn't which she was very much appreciative for. Of course, she felt bad for Luke, but for Rudy it was clear him losing had never even occurred to Sylphie. Okay, episode 39, Afar, covering chapters 8 to 11 from volume 10 of the light novel. I know the anime's been pretty heavy with all the slice of life stuff lately, but you'd be surprised to know that there could have been a whole lot more. I mean, you may not notice it with the way the anime portrays it, but the passage of time has been rather quick lately. From when season 3 started to where we are now, it's been almost half a year and things have been relatively peaceful. Of course, the novel isn't going to write about each of those days in detail, but it did spend an entire chapter describing one of them. Then, even in this most recent episode with Nanahoshi, you wouldn't have been able to tell due to how quickly everything happened, but 2 months have passed since Rudy and Sylphie were married, another several days from when the letter came, a month after that for the incident with Nanahoshi, then even an entire week for when Nanahoshi was living at their house. 1 more week would be spent finally getting to the successful experiment, so in the span of 1 episode, this was 3.5 months that had gone by. It's a progression of time that I feel needs to be mentioned since it helps to make sense of why things happen so fast in the anime. Unless you were aware of the months that had passed, you'd probably think this all took place over a week or something. Now, to briefly mention some key events from that day in the life chapter, mornings were often spent training with Bodigadi. He would spectate or spar depending on the day, then occasionally join for breakfast and leave straight after. Rudy would then head to school to check up on Cliff and Zanaba, and it was both their research that we would get an update on. Cliff was in the middle of creating his own magical instrument, so if his theory was right, then it was very possible to create one capable of negating curses. As for what this theory entailed, it inferred that magical items and curses functioned the same. You see, if a curse placed on an object produced a magic item, and a curse placed on a person made them a cursed child, the fundamental properties of their origin seemed very similar. This made Cliff think that if something could be done about the effects of a magic item, then the same could be said for the effects of a curse. It was the basis behind his knowledge of magic circles in general, and a solid explanation for why he was so well versed in it later. Zanaba was doing his research on the doll, and the majority of that consisted of deciphering the journal they'd found. It was a lofty task he spent most of his day on, and this left Julie to do work on her own stuff. It had been 1 year since Julie was bought, and her progress with earth magic was actually quite astonishing. In fact, if she continued practicing with the daily lessons Rudy provided for her, then Rudy knew she'd be an expert at it in no time. This would mean that they could move on to the next phase of their plan, and that meant that they were 1 step closer to the mass production they were planning. Now, the next part of Rudy's day was lunch, then his advanced healing and intermediate detoxification classes. Nenahoshi's experiments were what came next, and it would always be tense as there was this looming sense of irritation and impatience. 6 months of magic circles were tested to no avail, so that meant it was time for her to move on to something different. Rudy would then go meet up with Sylphie, and it's here we get to the most important thing from this day in the life bit. Sylphie's schedule is unbelievably busy. Only once every 3 days does she get to spend the night at home, and that was only because Alina Lise offered to watch the princess for her. On the days she didn't, Sylphie would have to spend the night at school, and it was before that that she would usually go and walk home first. She would finish class, go home and cook dinner, then do some cleaning, take a bath, and go back to school. This wouldn't be that bad if the house was close, but with the walk being 30 minutes at least, I'm sure 2 hours of travel each day would get rather tiring, especially with the school, work, and chores in between all that. Rudy of course felt the same, but Sylvie's response was that she liked doing all of that. It just made the time they did get to spend together even more special. So it was the nights she spent at home which were about as horny as you'd expect, and it eventually got to the point where Rudy felt guilty for it. He wanted to exercise self-control and not treat her like an object, but Sylvie's express permission would always convince him otherwise. Rudy knew he was weak and wanted to show respect, but at the same time this was everything he'd ever dreamed of. There was a whole list of things he wanted to do or have done to him, so whenever Sylvie would give him the go-ahead, he would just lose control and forget everything. So much so that he'd actually been able to complete half his list already. He obviously didn't do anything Sylvie didn't want him to do, but the lengths she went to make him happy were far greater than the lengths he went for her. It's the reason he felt the need to make it up to her, leading to their eventual deal to teach each other magic. This happens a bit later on in the episode though, so before that we first need to talk about the day the letter came. It was a morning unlike any other, and Rudy was lying in bed both horny and happy. The bliss of waking up next to someone like Sylvie made him wonder if this was what it was like to be truly happy. To him, this is what he felt life was worth living for. So, things had been relatively peaceful, and it was an amazing feeling knowing such a sensation would be experienced every 3 days now. There was one major thing that had happened though, and that's the shonen-esque sub-story happening within the university. You see, unbeknownst to Rudy and his relaxing home life, an image had built around him which he probably wouldn't agree with. This wasn't something he was aware of up until now, but somehow he'd become the boss of the school. He was the leader of the most fearsome group Renoa had ever known, and to all the students they had come to refer to them as this, Rudy's demonic circle of 6. It was a group very similar to the 4 Heavenly Kings, and their ranks consisted of exactly who you'd expect. The obvious were Zanoba, Cliff, Linnea, and Persena, then the not so obvious were Fitz and Bodigadi. All supposedly answered to Rudy, and all needed to be defeated if anyone wanted to get to him. So, if someone wanted to challenge Rudy for his control of the school, it was common knowledge now that they first needed to defeat the 6. A cursed child, a genius, a royal guard, 2 beast girls, and a demon king. Only then would they have the right to challenge Rudy, and that was an occurrence which Rudy hoped would never happen. I mean, if the person challenging him was strong enough to beat Bodigadi, then that was a separate problem all on its own. Obviously, no one ever got past the first challenge, and it was in cases like that that the person challenging would just end up becoming their subordinate. Like, there was this one first year who randomly became part of their group, and that was simply because Zanoba had annihilated him in a duel. It was a prideful newcomer who defeated all the other delinquents in his grade, so that naturally gave him the confidence to challenge Rudy. Given the rules of the school though, he first needed to defeat the 6, and that resulted in him challenging Zanoba first. It was a fight that started off closer than you may expect, but one that fizzled out as soon as the first year started running out of mana. All Zanoba had to do was hold out until then it was super easy to close the gap and knock him out. So that's how Rudy gained a new indirect subordinate, and it was all part of the territory of being the university's boss. This wasn't a power Rudy was necessarily unhappy with, since it made intervening with bullies super easy. All he had to do was tell them to stop, then immediately they would and run away. It was something he'd do even if he wasn't the boss, since as long as he lived, Rudy wouldn't allow anyone to harass the weak. It was a core belief that defined who he was in this new life. Now, it was later that day that Rudy would receive the letter, and it was in the novels that Paul's guilt would be expressed even more. He felt bad for missing Rudy's 15th birthday, and even more so by the fact he'd be missing Norn and Aisha's 10th. He also felt bad for offloading his sisters to Rudy, since not only did he ask Rudy to just take care of them, but he also requested he find a house and even enroll them into school. It was a job Paul knew he should be doing as their father, but one he couldn't since getting Zenith was important too. At the very least, he was confident he could handle that, and he assumed if all went well, he'd be back with her in a year or two. Norn and Aisha's circumstances would then be described in a little more detail, and it was Norn who Paul felt Rudy needed to look out for. Since she wasn't gifted the same way that him or Aisha was, it was only natural that she felt a bit isolated. Combine that with Paul spoiling her, making her a bit selfish, and there was no doubt that she would prove to be a bit difficult. This was the contents of what Paul wrote, and it essentially chalks up to Paul feeling bad about everything. In any case, the fact Paul needed him to buy a house made Rudy relieved in the fact that he had already bought one. The main concern with having Norn and Aisha live there, though, was the impact on their education that Rudy's nightlife would have on them. He figured he would have to put them in the rooms farthest away from his. Now, something I wish the anime included was Rudy's realization that he needed to ask Sylphie first. He knew being a good partner meant consulting on things together, so rather than just state Norn and Aisha were going to live with them, he instead went and asked for permission first. He would present Sylphie with the letter in the kitchen, then let her read it before saying anything. At first, she was a bit disappointed the news of their marriage hadn't yet reached him, but that expression quickly turned serious as soon as she was finished. It wasn't because the letter had mentioned anything particularly concerning, but it did remind Sylphie of her own parents. She was faced once again with the fact that they weren't around anymore, and the remembrance of that clearly showed via the concern on her face. Rudy would then apologize for being so insensitive, but Sylphie would reassure him by saying she had a new family now. There was no need for her to be unhappy, since being lonely wasn't something she needed to worry about anymore. It was this that made Rudy want to start a family with her even more now, and that brought up the question of whether they were even ready to have a kid. Rudy was sure things would be fine if they did, since if every other living thing was capable of having one, then there was no reason that he and Sylphie couldn't handle it either. Besides, with Paul planning to show up with Lilia and Zenith, there would be plenty of capable adults present to help raise his kids. This brings us now to Rudy and Sylphie's magic lessons, which, as we saw, went well for Sylphie, but not so much for Rudy. Sylphie was learning the fundamentals relatively quickly, while Rudy was making pretty much no progress at all. To give a bit more context on why that is, since healing magic required using your own mana to alter the flow of another person's mana, perhaps Rudy was just unable to envision that. Perhaps he couldn't conjure the feeling of someone else's mana interfering with his own, and perhaps that was the reason he couldn't silently heal or use any other type of support magic. As for Sylphie, disturb magic was something Rudy wanted her to keep a secret. He told her who it was he had learned it from, but didn't tell her how he almost died while doing so. So, out of fear that Orsted might not like the distribution of this magic, Rudy warned Sylphie not to teach it to anyone. The two would then compete in their magical tug-of-war game, and the winner would get to do in bed whatever they wanted to the loser. Rudy would then bring up the topic of having kids again, and this would turn the conversation horny for both of them. You're probably best not knowing the cringy stuff Rudy says after this, but the gist is that Rudy treats sex like an H game. Well, sometimes anyway. You can read the rest on screen here, but now I'm just gonna move on to the next part. It was 1 month after the letter that the incident with Nanahoshi would happen, but before we get to the breakdown itself, there's a bit more to be said about the theory of how all this works. Obviously, the bigger and more complex the object you try to summon, the more mana required to make it happen. This is the way the conservational laws of energy work in this world, and if it reigned true with this experiment here, the amount of energy being used for this would only result in a 1 meter teleportation incident. That is, if the experiment grew out of control anyway. Even if it somehow did through all of Nanahoshi's safety precautions, Rudy was certain he'd be able to find his way back anyway. He wasn't nearly as concerned about being teleported again as you might think he should be, even going so far as to joke about it. Nanahoshi would then go on to explain the principle behind her circle too, but because Rudy didn't understand it from his perspective, that meant we didn't get to either. So the experiment would start and fail just like how we saw in the anime, then Nanahoshi would erupt and have her breakdown. The anime only alluded to the idea of self-harm or worse, but the novel straight up confronts it and brings it to the forefront. It constantly parallels the mental state between her and Rudy's and clearly describes the impact that it has on him. The anime didn't do too great showing this in the infirmary, but the face we see here is the face he had then too. His lips were parched and breathing heavy, and Zeniba himself even stated how he'd never ever seen Rudy this flustered before. I think this would have done well to hammer home just how serious this situation was to Rudy, and it would have made clear how easily a reminder of his past could affect him. Another significant portion the anime left out with Rudy was the responsibility he displayed while taking care of Nanahoshi. You see, Sylphie had actually shown up to see what was happening here. She overheard students talking about Rudy carrying a girl, then rushed over to the infirmary to see what was happening. It was then that Rudy would ask if Nanahoshi could stay with them, which was a question Sylphie would respond to by asking why. Since to her staying in the infirmary was probably better, Sylvie couldn't understand why Rudy would push for otherwise. This wasn't because she was suspicious Rudy would do anything, but was more so just because she didn't know how to handle Nanahoshi. So, if Nanahoshi really was going to stay with them, then Sylvie made it clear that she would be Rudy's responsibility. Now, it was on the way to the house that Rudy truly contemplated Nanahoshi's life, and it was while doing so that he understood how everything led up to this. You see, he could tell from carrying her just how light she was, and that made it clear that she wasn't eating enough. Her commitment to her work meant she probably didn't socialize, and if her only focus was to get back home, then the stress of not making progress was likely agonizing. It was all this that was constantly bubbling to the surface, and the breaking point was the recent failure killing 2 years of research. It was a fatal blow that had made her last 6 years worthless. The circumstances were definitely different from the trauma Rudy had been through in his own life, but the mental anguish was all the same for sure. If he had to compare it to something he went through himself though, a similar setback was the time he'd been banned from a video game. He'd spent several years no-lifing this one online game, only to one day get banned and lose everything. The entire day he wasn't able to process anything, and when he realized nothing he could do would get it back, the next month he had spent unmotivated to do anything. It was a learning experience in which Rudy vowed to never touch an online game again. Now, this definitely wasn't the same, but whether the pain from this or the trauma from his bullying, the depression which arose from it was something Rudy was all too familiar with. It had allowed him to relate to Nanahoshi on a far more personal level. This brings us to when Nanahoshi is finally at their house, and while the anime showed Sylvie to be the one to find the knife, it was actually Rudy since Sylvie wasn't even around for any of this. This presents a slightly different message from the anime, since by Rudy being the sole caretaker of Nanahoshi, it shows the level of responsibility he's willing to take to ensure she makes it through all this. It highlights the extent to which he resonates with what she's going through and shows a more empathetic side that we don't usually get to see. This is all because her pain reminded him of his own, and to see it all from beginning to end, well, it was hard not to see his old self in her. So, a whole week would go by with Nanahoshi staying at Rudy's, and aside from eating and sometimes showering, very little agency was being shown on her part. Her ambition was gone, and in its place, resignation. It was one day while Rudy was watching over her, though, that out of nowhere Nanahoshi would suddenly start talking again. She would describe the circuit board she was trying to create and lament over how no matter how much she changed the wiring, this one part just wouldn't connect to the rest. Brute force would only cause defects, and a patch in that defect would just create another defect. So, like a software engineer trying to debug their code, Nanahoshi would be stuck in an endless loop of non-stop bug fixing. She simply couldn't solve the problem of connecting this one circuit to another. Rudy would just listen silently as Nanahoshi said her piece, and that's when he would decide to bring the others in. It's a scene that I actually want to delve into more because of the theory in it, but one that'll unfortunately have to be in the next video. Ruijerd's return came with more than just two little sisters for Rudy. What the anime passed off as a relatively somber reunion was in actuality a revelation containing so much more, specifically with regards to how Rudy's perceived Eris's departure over the past few years. This wasn't just a simple passing thought, but instead a genuine concern that stuck with him for many days after, at least up until that incident with Norn. So, as we look at that and the introduction to Norn and Aisha, there's quite a bit in between that you're gonna want to hear about. Let's get started. Episode 40, Norn and Aisha, covering Chapter 12 from Volume 10 of the light novel and Chapters 1 to 3 from Volume 11. After having sat down with Ruijerd to reconnect, the first thing Ruijerd had asked was actually about Eris. The anime simply mentioned how things got complicated, but it was in the novels that Rudy recounted pretty much everything. From the moment he left to the night they spent after, Rudy told Ruijerd all about how Eris had left him. He then spoke of his despair and the 2 years he spent searching for Zenith, then his encounter with Alina Lise and even the recommendation from the man god. It was any and everything Ruijerd had missed, all the way up to Rudy's wedding. Now, the reason Ruijerd was so confident that this was all just a misunderstanding was because to him this was something that happened often. As he explained to Rudy, something like this was an outlook warriors often got bogged down by, a mindset Ruijerd was certain Eris couldn't possibly hate Rudy with. So that's when Ruijerd would suggest Rudy should think a bit more literally, and it was that thought which made Rudy reconsider everything. He began to wonder if it was him who got it all wrong. What if Eris really did just leave to get stronger? What if she was truly just trying to achieve balance then come back later? If this was the true intent of the simple message she had left for him, then the meaning behind her words were also just as simple as "wait for me." It was a terrifying thought that made Rudy shudder at what it could possibly entail for him. Now that he had finally overcome his trauma and been saved by Sylphie, he couldn't imagine coming face to face with Eris again. Even if there was the chance that they could make things right, just the possibility of her rejecting him again was enough to make him want to avoid such an encounter. So, Rudy would change the topic to something else, and that's when we find out more about what it is Ruijerd had been doing. You see, his time in the southern forest was actually spent searching for Spurd. If they were going to be hiding anywhere, then this was the most likely out of all the places in the central continent. It was after 2 years of exhaustive searching, though, that no trace of his fellow Spurd could be found anywhere. He did find several items belonging to some unlucky casualties of the displacement incident, but no actual clues towards any of his own people. Ruijerd then headed to Eastport to catch up on information coming out of Millis, and that's where he met up with Paul. He was initially planning to head to the conflict zone and search through there next, but after meeting Paul, that's when a little detour was decided. The chance encounter with him and Norn is actually something that happens in a bonus chapter, but rather than explain that detail for detail, the SparkNotes version is essentially this. Norn gets upset because she can't stay with Paul, storms off and gets into a bit of trouble, then gets saved by Ruijerd, who then walks her back to Roxy and Lilia. Now, it was the speed in which they got here which highlighted Aisha's intellect, since not only did her suggestion ensure they traveled both during the day and night, but she had even optimized their path to ensure whichever caravan they were on was always the fastest. This sometimes involved doubling back to a city they'd already passed, since a caravan which left from there had a more direct route than a caravan from anywhere else. It was the first time in a while that Ruijerd had been ordered around like that, alluding to his time back when he was still the captain to Laplace. So, as Ruijerd worked as both caretaker and guard, Aisha too would tirelessly work to calculate the most efficient route for them. It was a no-breaks plan that took little account for stamina, eventually leading both her and Norn to collapse from exhaustion partway through. Now, if you're wondering why it is Ruijerd's only staying for less than a day, the main reason is because he heard rumors of a devil out in the woods. Since his goal was to find more of his people, Ruijerd figured this rumor was one worth investigating, one that was likely a little bit time-sensitive. This was the reason Ruijerd had given on the surface, but for Rudy he also couldn't help but feel like a rift had formed between them. He knew him not being with Eris likely came as a shock, but perhaps it was the two of them together that formed the foundation for all three of them to get along. I mean, there was a clear loneliness in the way Ruijerd spoke, and it was very likely Rudy being with Sylphie just didn't feel right to him. That's not to say Rudy regretted what he had done, but in this conversation with Ruijerd, he couldn't help but feel as if he'd made some kind of mistake. It was shortly after that Sylphie would come in and meet Ruijerd here, and the exchange between them was a little bit short. The full extent was an awkward handshake and a simple exchange of names. Ruijerd would then head upstairs and go to bed, and Sylphie would question if she'd done something to offend him. Of course, Rudy wasn't going to say that she did, but even he could tell that his marriage to Sylphie bothered Ruijerd a bit. As for where Ruijerd slept, since there wasn't any specific room that Rudy had picked out for him, Rudy just said that he could sleep anywhere. It may be a bit surprising to know he chose to sleep in Norn and Aisha's room, but Rudy understood that this was just part of who he was as a guardian. I mean, even when it was just him and Eris, Ruijerd never took his eyes off them even when they were sleeping. So, though to us it may seem like something strange, this was completely normal behavior for someone as protective as Ruijerd. Besides, if it was something suspicious, then Rudy knew Ruijerd never would have let his footsteps be heard in the first place. Now, the next morning started rather differently, since while normally Rudy would be horny beyond control, that sensation simply wasn't present today. The thought of Eris weighed so heavily on his mind that gloom and restlessness were the only emotions he was feeling right now. Still, he would get up and get ready to exercise, but as soon as he stepped outside, you know what was happening. Standing in front of him was the immortal Demon King and the captain of the Plaza's Imperial Guard. Two warriors who fought on opposite sides and more than likely knew each other from all those centuries ago. You could tell that things were tense, since not only was Bodygotti not wearing his usual smile, but Rudy could sense Ruijerd's potent killing intent. He may have said how he had no intention of fighting, but his noticeable aura clearly dictated otherwise. As for the potential grudge these two shared, well, with Richard having been a victim of the curse's madness, it was more than likely him and his comrades ended up killing some of Bodygatti's. Given their behavior was to attack any and everyone, there was no doubt that that had to have included some of Bodygatti's people. So, with Bodygatti being the king he is, it didn't matter that he was uncommitted to his role as such. If someone did wrong to his people, then it was likely he sought out revenge for them. And if not for something as petty as revenge, then perhaps he just acted in the way of justice on behalf of all his powerless citizens. Either way, there was no doubt Richard killed some of Bodygatti's people, and Bodygatti went and got his revenge for it. This brought into question whether Bodygatti knew the truth of why the Spurred even acted that way, and it was something Rudy felt he needed to talk with him about. There's no explanation as to why Bodygatti just walked away at the end of it, but at the very least we now know a bit of his history. It seems there's at least one person that Bodygatti doesn't get along with. Now, one of the more important things to note from Richard's departure is the extent to which Eris is affecting Rudy's handling of it. You see, while there are all these things and all these people Rudy wanted Richard to see, this looming thought of Eris prevented him from asking Richard to stay longer. Once again, it wasn't because of Sylphie, but was instead simply due to this feeling that he couldn't talk properly to Richard until things were fixed with Eris. It's for that reason Rudy lets Richard go, and it's a good example of just how much Eris is weighing on both of them right now. It's when we get to Rudy's conversation with his sisters after that a few minor details were left out from it. Aisha's mannerisms were way too formal for Rudy's liking, and it was something Aisha mentioned came from him. She was merely reciprocating the way Rudy talked to her before. It's not that speaking so formally was necessarily bad though, but it was almost as if Aisha took Rudy's politeness to mean he wanted to keep her distant from him. It made Rudy question if this was how it was when he talked to everyone, and even made him think perhaps he should start talking more casually to people. Aisha would then ask about Eris, and though you would expect Rudy to be rather discreet about it, he had actually given a basic rundown of pretty much everything that had happened. Minus all the more mature stuff, Rudy had given both Norn and Aisha an update on how his life has been. That's when Aisha would present Rudy with the chest, and within was enough money to last the three of them a decade. So long as Rudy spent it wisely, the funds Paul provided were actually quite plenty. Within the chest was also a letter from Lilia, and it was here that she had given her opinion on Norn and Aisha. To her, Aisha was extremely gifted. A child who knew she was smarter than others, and that unfortunately left her a little bit prideful. Norn, on the other hand, was completely ordinary, so when compared to her sister who was objectively amazing, this left Norn both sullen and withdrawn. She did act tough to make herself seem stronger, but Lilia knew this was all just an act. So, given what Lilia knew, she advised Rudy to be strict with Aisha while at the same time be kind and gentle to Norn. They were instructions that seemed a bit unfair to Aisha, but perhaps this was Lilia seeing herself as Paul's mistress still. Perhaps if she acted like the second wife she officially was, then maybe she would have been less soft on Norn and more so to Aisha. Now, to further contrast Norn and Aisha's differences, whereas Aisha was beginner in Water God style and beginner in all 6 basic elements of magic, Norn was completely normal and average. She would test right in the middle of all her classes, whereas Aisha aced everything from literacy to geography. They were completely different in every way imaginable. This was clearly something Norn was very sensitive about, since while the argument in the anime was verbal at most, a bit of a fight broke out the more Aisha insulted her. Norn had grabbed Aisha's hair first, then the two devolved into back and forth pushing and pulling. Luckily, it wasn't anything as serious as punching, but the tears in Norn's eyes made it clear topics like this were touchy. Now, the next day, Rudy would go schedule Norn and Aisha's test with Genius, and it was after that he would ask about Bodygatti. Unfortunately, Genius hadn't seen him, but if he did, he would tell him that Rudy was looking for him. Rudy would then go check up on Nanahoshi, and to his surprise, she wasn't doing any research at all. Since their party was just the day before, she was actually in bed groaning about her hangover and headache. The two would then go into a conversation about siblings, and aside from the rare compliment about Rudy's appearance, we would also find out Nanahoshi has a brother of her own. Sylphie would be who Rudy would meet up with last, and while the majority of their conversation was pretty much how we saw in the anime, an interesting question was posed which I think is important to the Sylphie-Ariel relationship. Rudy had asked if she would have accepted the marriage if he told her to quit her job first, and Sylvie responded simply by saying no. There was a good chance she would have turned him down in an ultimatum like that, since the love she felt for Ariel was just as strong as the love she had for Rudy. Yes, the types of love were fundamentally different, but a love like that was enough to make Sylvie want to be there for her. Especially since Sylvie knew Ariel wasn't the type of person who could take care of herself alone. That's why Sylvie knew she couldn't abandon her, and though she felt it was kind of unfair to Rudy, it was a strong conviction she was willing to stand by. Of course, such a thing wasn't unfair at all, but to Sylvie she probably felt like she was taking advantage of Rudy. It was clear she felt bad that she had to split her time so much. Fast forward to after Norn and Aisha had taken their tests, and because Aisha had gotten a perfect score, not only did she earn the right to become Rudy's personal servant, but she'd also been offered admission as a special student. Of course, her desire trumped such a privilege, so it was from this point on that Aisha would be a maid. Norn, on the other hand, wasn't quite so exceptional, but the reason Rudy decided to give her what she wanted was because to deny her request may make her resent him more than she does already. Since he knew what it was like to be a shut-in himself, he also knew what not to do when trying to fix someone like that. You see, whenever his own family had tried to engage and make him feel better, each time it had only made him withdraw further from them. To him, it made him feel like some sort of animal rather than a human. So, in an effort to make Norn feel like she wasn't trapped like how he felt, Rudy thought it was best to keep an eye on her from a distance. Plus, with Aisha always being so condescending, it was probably better for Norn's development if she didn't have to deal with all that. And since Rudy knew what it was like to grow up with exceptional siblings, he understood why such an environment would be so unappealing for her. That said, getting Aisha to understand this was a whole different problem. Since to her Norn didn't seem like she deserved this treatment, Rudy needed to explain why without saying, "because I said so." That's when he would think back to what his parents would always say, and it was from this that he knew the basic answers just wouldn't work with her. Since they never satisfied him, he figured it was best to try something different. So this was 3 examples where Rudy used his past life to his advantage, and they were all for the betterment of the sisters he was now taking care of. It's rather rare we see Rudy reflect on his past life so much, but I think it's important to know since it shows that he's learning from it. It exhibits a level of responsibility and compassion that may not have already been apparent in this scene. Now, to add a bit more context as to why Aisha felt so strongly about this, it essentially boils down to Lilia and the Latria family. What I mean is that if Aisha's own mother was never able to consider herself the second wife of Paul, then it makes sense Aisha would never feel equal herself either. Then, with Zenith's family reinforcing this idea by treating her as this illegitimate daughter, it was only natural Aisha channel all that hate towards trying to be better than Norn. It's not like Paul treated them any differently himself, but with everyone else making that difference so apparent, such circumstances were all but bound to create a divide between them. Fortunately, none of those people were around anymore, so for Norn and Aisha this was kind of a fresh start for them. They both just needed to get past their own built-up mentalities first. So, it was a few days later that the decided plans would be put into action, and with Norn's enrollment pretty much secured, Aisha had settled nicely into her position as maid. The amount of chores she did extended far beyond just the ones we saw in the anime. She would even entertain guests whenever they came over, and the usual person was Nanahoshi when she wanted a bath. It was a level of hospitality Nanahoshi couldn't believe Rudy would force on his own younger sister. It was in the rare times that she wasn't doing chores, though, that Rudy would sit her down and teach her magic. You see, sure, beginner spells were enough for Aisha to live a normal life, but if she ever felt the need to defend herself, intermediate spells were absolutely necessary. So, Rudy would have her exhaust her mana supply every day, then give her a few homework assignments to advance her knowledge of magic. It was at night that Aisha would occasionally sleep in the same bed as Rudy, then whenever Sylvie was home, that's when things got risky. What I mean is that with zero privacy and zero means to blow off steam the way that Rudy normally did, there was a build-up Sylvie knew Rudy needed to satisfy. This would lead to them doing it multiple times despite Aisha being in the next room over, and the only thing Rudy could do to mitigate her hearing was to barricade the door with earth magic. It was definitely risky, but more than necessary for him, especially with Sylvie always prodding to do more. Norn and her isolation may have been the focus of this episode, but it's Rudy's trauma that's the overarching theme here. Just like how it was with Nanahoshi's breakdown, Norn shutting herself in forced Rudy to face his inner demons, and the traumatic response it caused allowed him to finally overcome them. He was able to reflect on why things happened the way they did on Earth and see from a different perspective the way it had affected him. This in turn helped him to find the best solution for these two, and in a way, them breaking through also allowed him to break through. Whatever lingering regrets and remorse Rudy had from his shut-in days were now gone, as indicated in the final lines of the episode. This was the recurring theme for the majority of Season 2, and now that his character is less hindered by his past, it serves as the perfect moment to transition into a turning point. Before we can get to that though, there was quite a bit more to Norn's story that we need to examine first. The true extent to her emotional buildup and why it is she became a shut-in herself. So, as we look at that and Rudy's self-reflection through her, we'll get to see everything we missed from what I found was the best episode of Season 2 so far. Let's get started. Episode 41, My Older Brother's Feelings, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 11 of the light novel. To Rudy, Norn's abrupt decision was quite the serious one, because the day he decided to isolate himself in his past life had resulted in him becoming a shut-in for the rest of his life. The reason he never left his room after that was because he truly thought that everyone was out to get him. To him, the world was a dangerous place in which bullying was the only thing that awaited him. So, with bullying being the very thing that started all this, to Rudy he felt it was easiest to just avoid that misery altogether. And that wasn't the worldview that Rudy wanted Norn to be stuck with. In fact, when Rudy first heard that Norn had shut herself into her room, it had actually triggered a trauma response which took Rudy back to the very mistake that had created this worldview for him. That one instance where he stood up for himself in the cafeteria was the sole moment that to him changed his life forever. So if there was even a possibility that Norn was going through the same thing now, Rudy was determined to punish those responsible. He would seek justice until Norn felt that she was safe again. It didn't matter who he hurt in the process, since if they were terrorizing Norn, then Rudy was sure to make them regret it. Of course, Rudy's interrogation revealed the cause was him all along, and it brings up this underlying issue that Norn has constantly had to deal with. You see, even before she'd enrolled into the university here, she always felt compared to Aisha. This wasn't just at school either, since at home her grandmother made sure to make those differences clear too. She made sure to let Norn know exactly how inferior she was. So, before Norn could even settle down and start experiencing this new chapter of her life, not one full day went by before she was being compared all over again. She was experiencing the exact same treatment she received back in Millis. The only thing that changed was the person she was being compared to. That being the case, to Norn it must have seemed that no matter where she went, she would always be forced to hear about just how unspectacular she was. Her interactions were a constant reminder that she was the least talented member of her family. Combine this with the fact that Rudy's behavior was perceptibly short of exemplary, and to be inferior to someone like that, well, I'm sure it only made the comparisons feel 10 times worse. Rudy wasn't gonna let that stop him from trying to help though, because he knew from experience the longer she stayed in there, the worse it'd get for her. He knew even just a month could have serious consequences. She likely wouldn't start to regret it until at least a year or two later, but at that point the damage would be done already. Whatever feelings of remorse she'd have about wanting to do things differently wouldn't change the fact that the past however many years were wasted. Norn may not be able to realize it now, but it was only a matter of time before she did. And it was Rudy's job to help her realize that sooner than later. Rudy would then ask Linnea and Prasenna what they would do in this situation, and their response clearly showed that they were too narcissistic to even understand what Norn was going through. They did, however, know someone who was like Norn, and you'd be surprised to hear that it was actually their Aunt Ghislaine. You see, she used to go around starting fights all the time, then one day she ended up training and became a Sword King. Ghislaine's case was a little bit different though, since while there was definitely a chance Norn had some latent unexplored talent, it didn't have to be swordplay or magic. There were plenty of interests Norn could explore that neither him nor Aisha had even considered. This was a potential solution for Norn's particular case, but in the off chance she wouldn't be talented at anything, she could always do what Zanaba did and be happy simply indulging in a specific hobby. That said, Rudy did also consider that he may just be overreacting a bit. I mean, Norn was after all only 10 years old now. This was only her second day in her room too, so if this was just her being sulky, then to call her a shut-in would be a bit premature right now. That didn't mean Rudy was just gonna sit back and wait either, since as her older brother, he knew he actively needed to support her. The space which he thought she may have needed before was no longer seeming like the proper solution anymore. It was possible staying hands-off would turn out to be the best for her, but considering her age, Rudy felt like more attention was better. These were all the things Rudy was thinking about as he approached Norn's situation. Eventually, he'd come up with the covert operation with Linnea and Persena, and that whole part where he opens the door to himself was a fantastic creative choice unique to the anime. There's a real emphasis on all the inner demons Rudy has to fight against, especially since the breakdown with Nanahoshi caused a similar relapse too. So, it was as Rudy walked towards Norn in her room that he would remember all the things he hated hearing. He wasn't gonna pressure her or say she was causing trouble or even confront her in a way a parent should to a 10-year-old. Perhaps a slap on the head may make her do what he wanted now, but as a long-term solution it definitely wouldn't solve anything. Plus, with the reason for her being here falling solely upon him, Rudy knew he didn't have the right to do any of that. If anything, he felt it should be him apologizing to her. Saying sorry wasn't gonna change anything though, so the only action now was to hash it out together. Though he didn't know the words or exactly how to act, Rudy did his best to talk, saying whatever he could to strike a chord with her. Eventually, he came to realize he just didn't understand her, and that was in part due to the distance he decided to keep from her. It was in this moment Rudy came to see that he didn't know anything about his sister. What he thought was an effort to give her space was in actuality him not even trying to get to know Norn. This made Rudy think perhaps this was actually a lost cause, but when he remembered the times his own brother came and did the same, that's when he knew that this had to be handled by him. There was no use waiting for Paul or anyone else to try and fix this, since if he left now then things may never change. As for the reason why Rudy felt that way, well, while his own brother sat in silence waiting for hours for him, he eventually left and stopped coming back. Others had come and tried to do the same, but in the end they too would be ignored and disregarded. Perhaps it was something his brother had arranged to try and help him, but Rudy's isolation made him certain that no one could understand how he felt. Well, now that he was on the receiving end of this treatment, Rudy finally had an idea of how his own older brother might have felt then. This brings us now to Norn's perspective, and though the anime portrayed most of the important stuff, there were several more layers to all the hardships she had to deal with. The first was the initial impression she got of Rudy, and despite Paul telling her how he was the one that provoked the fight, the only thing that mattered was that it seemed like Rudy was going to kill Paul here. She understood Paul mocked his journey and made light of his survival, but the fact her first impression of Rudy was him supposedly trying to kill Paul, well, that was reason enough for her to hate him. So it was that hate that constantly built a long time after, since everyone around her always felt the need to compliment Rudy. Whether it be Paul, Lilia, or his sister Aisha, the praise was inescapable and it only made Rudy even more despicable to her. Then Aisha was a person she hated almost as much too, because at the school they used to go to in Millis, Aisha would always insist on competing with her. Whether it was the classroom or the gym, Aisha felt the need to challenge Norn in everything, and in everything Norn would always lose to her. Aisha would then rub it in how much better she was, and that in turn made Norn feel like she was inadequate. Every day she was made to feel like this loser, and every day the pressure to become better was increased by her very own grandmother. Since Zenith's mother was aware of the way things were with her and Aisha, the contempt she had for Aisha was, to say the least, palpable. From the way she called her illegitimate to the high expectations she placed on Norn, it was clear Zenith's mother wasn't the very best grandparent. That being the case, there were certain bars that needed to be met for the lady of the Latria family, and to Norn that meant she needed to be competent. That's pretty difficult when the person you're competing against is Aisha though, since for Aisha the way she dealt with her problems was by being better than Norn. You see, the reason she felt the need to always challenge her was because that was the only way she could fight back against the people who denied her what she saw as her rightful place in the world. She wanted to see how far her potential could take her, but Lilia and Zenith's mother refused to acknowledge that. So the only thing she could do then was take it all out on Norn. As for the high expectations placed on Norn, this resulted in forced etiquette classes and specific ceremony lessons, none of which was anything Norn was particularly good at. She would mess up repeatedly and get scolded because of it, then even insulted, as apparently such behavior was a product of adventurer blood. To Norn, she knew this was an insult to both Paul and Zenith, so it wasn't long before she started hating her grandmother too. In fact, it's actually the reason she was able to stick with Paul past Millis rather than stay here. If not for Ruijerd showing up when he did, then Norn might have actually been able to convince Paul to let her go all the way to Begarit with him. It's lucky she didn't though, since if she did, she knew she would have made things a whole lot harder. Now, it was on their journey north that Norn would once again be faced with how inadequate she was. Aisha had somehow taken charge in a group with 2 adults, yet whenever Norn would try and do the same, anything she said basically got ignored. It wasn't fair that Aisha's opinions seemed to carry more weight than her own. I mean, they were both the same age after all. The only reason she was able to put up with it was because, unlike how her feelings would usually be ignored, Ruijerd would actually take the time and listen to her complaints. He displayed consideration for the way she felt, and that was something not many did around her. Even Ruijerd spent lots of time complimenting Rudy though, and to see such a stoic man smile at the mention of a name she despised so dearly, well, that's when hate started to turn to fear. To hear Rudy was this powerful magician worthy of respect only amplified the vision of violence that she knew for him. It made her terrified at all the things that he might do to her, and there was always this looming fear that she might get hit the same way her dad was. Fast forward to when she finally met Rudius again, and to see him prioritizing his happiness when Paul's out risking his life only fueled the flames surrounding her hate for him. She couldn't bring herself to say anything though, since if she did, she believed that Rudy might hit her. She wasn't even sure Ruijerd would step in if he did, and it was that feeling that no one would protect her that began the cycle of loneliness which would consume her. To her, there wasn't a single person that was on her side anymore. So, the best she could do to avoid the hate, the judgment, and the feelings of inadequacy was to stay out of the way and avoid everyone. At least that way no one would be able to tell her just how inferior she was. Eventually, she would be told to apply for university, and the fight which would come at the peak of this conversation would end in tears not because of Aisha but because of Rudy. Hearing him speak in such a stern voice triggered the innate fear that Norn had built up for him. She truly believed that Rudy was going to hit her here. Now, even though he didn't actually do so this time, Norn could never be certain that Rudy wouldn't do so next time. She wondered if this was the fear that she would constantly have to live with now. That's when the topic of dorms came up, and just like that, a solution to everything had appeared. You see, if she moved to the dorms, then she wouldn't have to see Aisha or Rudy anymore. She wouldn't be compared to anyone who was better, and she could just be herself and live her own life. It was the perfect solution to everything, yet when Rudy accepted it, we know that it made her feel sad a bit. Even so, her new life in the dorms was actually quite exciting. She gained a new roommate who was genuinely kind to her, and though her and the other beast folk were what her grandma would describe as demons, Ruijerd had been able to teach Norn otherwise. It was because of that that she was actually able to become friendly with Marissa. Class was drastically different from how it was in Millis, because rather than have numerous courses solely dedicated to religion, everything in Renoa was focused on magic. Coming in halfway made picking things up rather difficult too, so it was only natural that Norn would struggle a bit. In fact, Marissa had actually had to step in and tutor her for a while. This helped her to learn some of the basics that she missed, and that made the whole study process a bit less discouraging. I mean, there were plenty of times where Norn hated herself for being so stupid, even more so when her intelligence directly influenced whether she would have to live with Rudy or not. Then it was over time that Norn would start to hear more about Rudy, and it was the contradicting way in which everyone spoke of him that led to her breakdown and eventual isolation. The initial opinion was that everyone was afraid of him since he was after all the leader of the Demonic Six, a group of thugs who went around doing whatever they wanted. Rumor had it that 2 of them were collecting panties on his direct orders, so to hear Rudy was doing that while Paul was risking his life once again led Norn's opinion of him to sink even lower. It wasn't fair that he got to fool around doing whatever he wanted here. What went to make things even worse was that despite all the peculiar things Norn heard Rudy did at school, his reputation was still mostly positive amongst everyone. He never did anything to hurt or harass anyone, and whenever he did see someone getting picked on, he would always step in and make them stop. Combine this with the non-stop praise for his exceptional magic, as well as the amazing tutoring skills he displays with Julie, and the conflicting portrayal of the Rudy she knew and the one everyone else did, eventually bubbled up to the breaking point we see here. She hated Rudy and thought he was a terrible person, but the hard truth to swallow was that she would never be able to compete with him. So, with everyone telling her to be more like him, a whole blanket of confusion and inadequacy began to envelop her again, eventually leading to the point where she just couldn't take it anymore. It was as all these emotions finally got the better of her that's when we get to the point where she's unable to leave her bed anymore. Her realization about Rudy was mostly the same after, but there was an extra bit where she looked at things from his perspective. As she considered what it was like to struggle the way that Rudy did, she realized she too probably would have punched Paul for his demeaning comments as well. So it was as she slowly came to see her and Rudy weren't so different that she also came to understand she should try to make amends with him. Unfortunately, it didn't matter how much she wanted to though, since at this point her body simply wouldn't move anymore. She knew what she had to do and she wanted to actually do it, but some part of her just wouldn't let her. That's when she would notice Rudy was already there, and while Paul and Ruijerd would have been by her side comforting her, Rudy kept his distance, watching silently. It was when he spoke with the utmost hesitation that Norn finally realized it was Rudy who was scared of her. She saw now that he was afraid of her rejecting him. The instant she understood that this was what Rudy was feeling was the same instant all her negative emotions dissipated. She no longer hated him or found him scary because what she saw in Rudy was the exact same thing she saw in Paul. It was a compassionate anxiety that was all too similar. This was only possible due to Norn's extreme sensitivity and empathy, which in turn makes her very in touch with her own emotions. It's the reason she's able to understand so quickly how Rudy is feeling and in turn sort through her own emotions herself. That would be it for Norn's side of things, which brings us now to how Rudy perceived it all. To him, what Norn did was a truly impressive accomplishment. She processed her emotions all by herself, then overcame whatever obstacles that were blocking her. To Paul and Aisha, she may just be this average kid, but to Rudy, his opinion of her was vastly different now. She'd displayed a feat of strength that Rudy's past self could never accomplish, and to be on the other end of it allowed him to understand his own problems from a different perspective. So, with this and Nanahoshi's breakdown allowing him to confront his own inner demons, you could say that there's two less weights holding Rudy down now. Episode 42, Turning Point 3, covering chapters 6 and 7 from volume 11 of the light novel. With a month having passed since Norn's incident, this would mark the second summer since Rudy arrived here. A change in season that often came with a change of outfits, since the warmer weather usually let people dress a bit more lightly. Unfortunately, the anime kept everyone dressed the same, but you can find those different outfits in the manga. The weather wasn't the only thing that had changed though, since a certain someone hadn't shown their face in quite a while. Whereas they'd occasionally stop by for dinner or watch Rudy train, ever since that stare down with Ruijerd, Bodygotti hadn't shown up since. It was likely he wandered off and forgot to tell anyone. It's something the anime doesn't really mention, but in the novel it's a recurring detail since Rudy has been actively looking for Bodygotti. Now, Rudy and Norn studying in the library was actually something that Norn had asked for. She personally made the request to be tutored by him. Of course, Rudy was ready to teach her everything, but out of worry that he may make Aisha feel left out, he decided to limit Norn's lessons to 1 hour daily, making it a condensed study session in which the two could review everything her classes covered that day. It was clear Norn was trying her best, but Rudy could tell understanding everything was difficult for her. Not nearly as much as it was for Eris or Ghislaine, but it would definitely take quite a bit of effort to get her up to speed with everything. So, it was while at one of these study sessions that Norn would change the topic to Ruijerd. It wasn't rare for them to have casual conversations like this, but most of the time Norn just wanted to talk about him. This would include where he was from and what the demon continent was like, then just like in the anime, the story of his spear. They were all things that reminded Rudy of his plan to help Ruijerd. The reason why he couldn't before was because a lot of his spare time was occupied heavily by advanced healing and intermediate detoxification classes. Remember, the spells here were akin to trying to memorize an entire book, something Rudy knew he was getting better at, but only due to the copious amounts of time that he put into it. He did consider spending that time upping his fire and wind magic to the saint level, but spells of that caliber typically required dramatic manipulations of the climate. They weren't really as practical as advanced healing or intermediate detoxification. Certainly not spells you were going to use on a day-to-day basis. That being the case, Rudy figured it was best to focus on something a bit more useful. This included Ruijerd's story, and the main hiccup with that was how to approach it. Like, he couldn't just do a basic good versus evil type story, since with the evil person being Laplace, those in the demon continent probably wouldn't like the story very much. I mean, he was to many considered a legendary hero there. This made approaching the story difficult and opened up the opportunity for Norn to step in. As it turns out, despite her writing being a little bit childish, the recount of Ruijerd's tales through her provided the punch Rudy was missing in his. Sure, it was a little bit rough, but the way it read made Rudy remember Ruijerd vividly, so much so that he would often tear up in the moments after. This meant all Rudy had to do was be Norn's editor, and the book would turn out much better than if he was to do it. Now, fast forward to after the shopping trip with Aisha, and the scene with Nanahoshi brings us to something interesting. Not just the 6-phase plan she'd laid out for Rudy, but the core division that separates summoning magic into fiend summoning and spirit summoning. These were the two fields in which summoning magic was generally divided into, and they both summoned completely different entities. Fiends were intelligent creatures that you had to make a deal with, whereas spirits were artificial entities created out of mana. So, if we were to focus on fiends first, these were most of the time monsters you'd find out in the wild. Garden variety creatures you'd have to pay some form of compensation to, after which they'd start to work for you. This wasn't just limited to those types of monsters though, since fiend summoning also allowed you to summon legendary beasts from other worlds. It could even summon inanimate objects too, which by definition made Nanahoshi's summoning a type of fiend summoning. Naturally, this made Rudy think he could use it to summon Roxy's panties, which probably wasn't the worst application he could come up with for it. But anyway, spirit summoning on the other hand was more like artificial intelligence. A brand new entity was created out of mana, and the extent to which they could operate needed to be coded into them, much like how software needed programming. This was implemented during the design for the spell itself, so the more complex the spell, the more capable the spirit being summoned. It actually goes to highlight the fundamental difference between spirits and fiends, since while fiends are harder to control and can act on their own, spirits are easy to control but only act on the patterns programmed into them. Of course, the more complex the code, the more complex the spirit, and there was no limit to how far one could take that. Like, the authority on summoning Nanahoshi mentioned in this episode actually had a spirit so complex it could pass for a human. That was just how in-depth this spirit summoning could be taken. There was, however, one caveat in the way this magic was perceived, since many believed spirits were beings that lived in the barren world. To them, they were different life forms being forcibly summoned into this world. That would simply make it a variation of fiend summoning, but the discussion of such a topic was never fully investigated to determine if that was true or not. So, for now, fiend and spirit summoning were completely different. Now, a quick addition to the scroll Nanahoshi gave Rudy was that she had actually given him permission to duplicate and sell it. If he wanted to make a template then print a bunch of copies, Nanahoshi said he was more than welcome to. Reason being that apparently the guy who made it had more pressing issues to worry about than the leak of a simple summoning scroll like this. So this was a nice asset to keep on hand if money got tight, and it would surely net him quite a bit if he did decide to sell it, especially if he mentioned it was from Nanahoshi. This brings us now to Rudy's encounter with Zanaba, and the only thing to note from here was the interesting dynamic between him and Ginger. A couple chapters back, there was that whole incident where Zanaba was strangling her, but abuse like that didn't seem to bother her at all. In fact, despite their arrangement being that of a master and servant, to Rudy it seemed much more like a weird commuter marriage. That or the bond between a cult leader and their most faithful disciple. Either way, what stuck out to Rudy was Ginger's approach to all this. She often kept herself out of view and only approached when needed, and despite there being a bodyguard room right next to Zanaba's, Ginger instead chose to sleep in an apartment down the street from him. She believed it was too presumptuous to reside next door to a prince like him. This is why Rudy asked the question that he did, and it made him think perhaps Ginger was some kind of masochist. Switching over to Cliff now, the contraption he built was more so described to be a sumo-sized loincloth. To further clarify the way it works, It essentially forces external mana in to counteract the internal mana within AniNews. The external mana is aligned with the frequency of the curses, and that in turn allows the two opposing flows to neutralize each other, kind of like the way that noise cancelling works. A frequency gets cancelled out by the presence of one that's the direct opposite to it. Cliff's design was only just a prototype, but for some reason AniNews insisted that it was good enough. To her, she didn't care how it looked, but to Cliff, he couldn't bear to have her even wear it. It was a point of conflict in which the two had actually gotten into a fight over. That's what led to his plan to miniaturize it, and the rest was pretty much as we saw. One last thing to note from this scene here though is that the device did absolutely nothing to make AniNews less horny. So even with the loincloth working the way it was supposed to, AniNews was still, well, AniNews. This brings us now to turning point 3, and the news of Rudy's child came a lot faster than he expected. Given how everyone was saying how elves had a hard time getting pregnant, he was surprised to hear that it had happened so fast. It was when he put his hand onto her stomach that the faintest bump could be felt coming from inside of it. It was a physical indication of what Rudy and Sylphie created together, and it was that realization that caused all sorts of emotions to arise in him. He knew what he was feeling was happiness, but to describe it only as such felt kind of inadequate. He couldn't put into words just how happy he was, but it was clear from his confusion that this emotion went far beyond that. Rudy would then get a bit frisky, even more so than what we saw, and Aisha would say a few sus things further indicating her interest in Rudy. She would then proceed with her duties as the maid and go inform Princess Ariel of these new developments. This brings forth a cutscene in which Rudy and Sylphie are alone, and it's here where they have more of a heart-to-heart about everything. Once again, Rudy couldn't find the right words to say, but the message he wanted to express was that he'll be there to help her. Raising this child wasn't something he wanted Sylphie to think she'd have to do on her own, so the only thing he wanted to say was how he was going to take responsibility. Sylphie then asked whether he wanted a boy or a girl, and as it was now, that didn't really matter to him. So long as the kid was healthy and happy, Rudy felt he'd be satisfied no matter what. Sylphie would then express how she truly felt like Rudy's wife now, and it was then that Rudy realized just how anxious she probably was about everything. I mean, since she was always saying how difficult getting pregnant was for her, she was likely feeling inadequate at the thought of not being able to produce a kid for him. Now that such a burden was lifted though, Sylphie could rest easy knowing that she could provide for Rudy. It did suck that he would have to put up with a dry spell, but in his own words he said he'd live. In fact, if he ever went and slept with another woman, then Rudy told Sylphie she could kick him out of the house for good. Sylphie assured him that even if he did, she wouldn't be angry, but she did say how she'd be sad. She'd understand why he went and did it, but would still feel dejected knowing it happened. It was a relatively mild reaction given the topic they were talking about. Of course, Rudy had no plans to betray her at all, because if Sylphie went out and did the same thing to him, then he couldn't even imagine how awful it'd feel. Now, it was later that evening that Aisha would return, and along with her came the congratulations from everyone she'd talked to. Xanabus said he'd visit in 5 days, Ariel a bit later in 10, then along with her Cliff and AniNews. Linnea and Prasenna said they'd visit whenever was convenient, and Nanahoshi simply said congrats. These were the messages from Rudy's closest friends here, minus Spotty since he was still missing. Now, normally Aisha would have taken this opportunity to flex on Norn, but instead she simply smirked with a look of pride. It wasn't exactly the non-competitive behavior Rudy was hoping for, but it was a good start considering things weren't quite as verbal anymore. That's not to say the two still didn't fight, but for now they weren't saying anything truly cruel to each other. It would just be a while before that lingering conflict between them was fully dissipated. Fast forward to 2 months after this, and that's when Rudy would receive word of Zenith's unsuccessful rescue. The letter was sent via express mail, but even that couldn't help it from taking 6 months to arrive here. It was immediately after that Rudy's world would flash white right before his eyes, and the next thing he knew he was talking to the man god again. So, to be transformed back into the person he hated so much instantly filled him with anger and resentment. It's the reason he was so hostile right from the get-go. The rest was pretty much word for word from the novels, then Rudy would find himself laying in bed. He couldn't remember how it was he had got there, so he could only assume that it was the shock that had gotten to him. Since the last thing he remembered was staring at the letter, that was the first thing that came to his head now. He recounted the alarming nature of such a message, then weighed it against that of what the man god had told him. This brought forth all the risks that came with traveling to Begarit, and the first was the possibility things were resolved by now. The second was the minimum year of travel it would take to get there and back, and the third was the possibility that he could die on this journey. They were all risks big enough to make him choose not to go right now. 3 days would pass without Rudy changing his mind, and the more he saw Aisha, Sylvie, and Norn, the more their looks of anxiety became apparent. This only made Rudy more uncertain in his decision, and it made him desperate for advice from the likes of Alina Lise and Zanaba. So, Alina Lise would mention how she would be abandoning her post with Ariel, mostly because there was actually very little real danger for her here. The whole thing was just a goodwill gesture on her part anyway, so her leaving wasn't something the princess could even object to. As for her breakup with Cliff, this was something Rudy knew would affect him significantly. Since most members of Millis stayed loyal to one person their entire life, Alina Lise just suddenly leaving could very well shake the foundations of his entire faith. There was no telling what a blow like that would do to him, especially for someone as devout as him. Alina Lise was so firm in the way she spoke though that Rudy knew he wouldn't be able to convince her otherwise. It also didn't help that she thought part of this was her fault either. Since she was the one who told Rudy to stay here initially, she couldn't help but feel that some of this mess was her responsibility. Switching over to Zanaba now, his whole conversation just confirmed that he was a real one. There's nothing to add other than that, so that brings us now to Rudy's turning point. The night before, he'd spent contemplating whether he should go or not, and for every reason he found making it seem like he should go, he just found another convincing him not to. It was a constant tug-of-war between betrayal and responsibility. It was Norn's act the day after that helped him to finally make up his mind, since it made him realize exactly the type of luxury he was dealing with. You see, unlike Norn, who didn't get to weigh her options of staying versus going, Rudy actually could. Though he didn't realize it at the time, just having the option to choose was a luxury that no one else could afford right now. I mean, it's not like Norn could just get up and travel to the Begarit continent because it wasn't something she knew how to do. Rudy, on the other hand, could make the journey, save his parents, and come back safely, yet here he was choosing not to. It was something that Norn didn't even have to fall to make him realize. All she had to do was ask why with all his power and experience he wasn't doing anything, and that was enough to make him understand. There were people who could take care of Sylvie while he was gone, but he was the only one who could save his parents. It's the reason why Geese wrote the letter to him and no one else. This would lead to Rudy's life-changing decision, and it marks the end of what was his once peaceful home and school life. So that's turning point 3 as it was in the novels, and as I'm sure you could tell, they did quite a good job bringing it to life. I'm sure some of you were expecting something as crazy as turning points 1 and 2, but not all turning points have to be super dramatic. They're simply points in the story where a decisive change is made, which in this case is Rudy leaving Sylvie and going to Begarit. If Rudy's journey to Begarit felt fast in comparison to his other travels, then you'd be right to think that since what would normally be 2 episodes was condensed into half of one. This included 7 full days of non-stop monster encounters, then an additional 2 weeks with a whole new set of characters and even an action-filled ambush with bandits. Unfortunately, finishing the Labyrinth arc meant setting those parts aside though, so I hope you're alright with settling with my video instead. I'll go through the true adventure Rudy and Alina Lise faced while crossing the desert, along with the left-out details from the events leading up to it. So, as we go through what we missed from this transitionary episode, hopefully you'll enjoy more what this amazing story has to offer. Episode 43, Desert Journey, covering chapters 8 to 12 from volume 11 of the light novel. To start things off with Rudy coming to terms with his decision, this would be the first time that he'd ever not listened to the man god. He wasn't just ignoring the advice he was given though, but instead taking it a step further and doing the exact opposite of what he recommended. It was a pretty big deal when he really thought about it, since if he'd done the same and didn't go to Sharonay when the man god told him to, then Lilia and Aisha would still be captives there. He would have never met Aisha and wouldn't have run into Orsted, and while sure the journey to Fatoa would have been easier, he probably wouldn't have heard the truth about Lilia and Aisha for years. That was one of the regrets he would have had to deal with, so it was likely the regrets he'd experience in Begarit were going to be similar. There was no telling what they'd actually be, but Rudy could imagine something as bad as losing a limb or even a parent. This was all part of the risk he was taking by going on this journey, but even that was better than waiting for years wondering what actually happened in Begarit. So Rudy would meet up with Alina Lise to tell her his decision, and it's here we find out how it is he was convinced Gisa's letter wasn't just an overreaction. I mean, both him and Alina Lise knew he was the type of person to overreact, but if you looked closer at the circumstances behind how the letter got there, the only way that was possible was if Paul gave Gisa's address. This made it clear that the two had met up already, so that ruled out the possibility of Gis trying to rescue Zenith solo. Why was it that Paul didn't send the letter himself then? Well, whether it be stubborn pride or something deeper, he clearly didn't want to involve Rudy in something he was responsible for. Then there was always the fact express mail wasn't cheap either, so that alone was a big indicator things were serious too. Now, there was a cutscene after this where Alina Lise and Rudy would be planning their route together, but considering the teleportation made all that irrelevant, the biggest issue aside from that was choosing what to bring and how to keep up with Alina Lise. I mean, Rudy was definitely fit and capable of making the journey, but when compared to the veteran experience of Alina Lise, he really was nothing more than an amateur. It was a gap in skill that made him worried he'd actually slow her down a bit. The other problem was Alina Lise's curse, since as I'm sure you know, her not sleeping with someone means she'll die. On casual journeys this wasn't much of an issue, but on a rapid expedition where breaks were minimal, finding a willing partner was definitely going to be difficult. Enough that Rudy figured they'd have to make time to find brothels on the way. This was a core part of their journey that the anime only briefly touched on, and as you'll soon see once we talk about it later, Alina Lise's curse became more of a pressing issue the longer they traveled for. Now, it was right after this conversation that Rudy would escort Alina Lise to Cliff, since if she was going to preserve her relationship with him, then it was best she talked to him sooner than later. So, Rudy would ask Cliff if he'd love her no matter what, and it was after that that he'd explain why she'd have to leave him for a bit. Of course, mentioning how sleeping with other men was an unfortunate necessity to it, which was something Cliff surprisingly didn't say a word to. He simply sat there listening to what Rudy had to say, not once interrupting him until he was finished. It was once everything was fully explained after that Cliff didn't even ask if he could go along with them, since he already knew how much of a burden he'd turn out to be. Both him and Alina Lise knew that he'd never make it. So instead, the only thing he could do was sit there and grit his teeth, a display of emotional maturity that had Rudy actually feeling bad for Cliff. He could tell that Cliff was definitely hurting, but the fact he held his tongue showed Cliff had a clear understanding of what he could and couldn't do, something not very many people were capable of. Cliff would then say all that stuff about wanting to get married, and Alina Lise's reaction to that was to push him over and start doing it right there. Naturally, Rudy would leave as fast as possible, and that brings us now to his goodbyes with these two. Before getting into how this could very well be the last time we see these two in a while though, Rudy first mentioned how someone told him he should make a move on them, a notion you may be surprised to know that both had actually shown a bit of excitement towards. This made Rudy consider how acting on it would turn out, since if the man god's words really were to be trusted, then he could expect Sylphie not to be mad at all. She definitely wouldn't kick him out of the house, and just like with all things the man god advised him on, it should, in the end, lead him to greater happiness overall. It was an alluring idea since Rudy couldn't help but think what a potential foursome would be like, but that was something he knew was best left to the imagination. Now, the goodbye was far more permanent than what we got in the anime, since with Rudy still operating under the assumption the journey would take 2 years, that meant by the time he came back, Linnea and Persena would be graduated. They would more than likely be back in the Great Forest, so unless Rudy went out of his way to see them there, this would be the last time him or us would see these two in quite a while probably. If anything, Rudy imagined it could be something like 10 or 20 years before he saw them again. Moving on to the scene with Nanahoshi. If you're wondering whether or not she's supposed to have this type of information, the likely and most probable answer is no. The very knowledge of teleporters was supposed to remain secret, so I doubt Orsted would want maps of them floating around anywhere. How was it that Nanahoshi was able to procure these maps then? Well, she had secretly bought maps whenever they were in a city, then marked the general locations of where she was going and what teleporters they had used in the area. If there wasn't a map to buy, then Nanahoshi would create her own using rough drawings and markings. Basic notation identified the cities and continents that she was traveling through, then variables were used for the ones that she didn't know. All in all, it was a rough record of every teleporter she passed through, but given she had to create it without Orsted even knowing, I'd say the results were rather impressive. It allowed Rudy to estimate that getting to Begarit would take 47 days only. Add in 1 extra month to save Zenith, then the whole round trip would be something more like 4 months. This made Rudy excited to go tell Alina Lise, so he would rush back to where he just left her and Cliff, then barge in to see the two pretty much naked. Cliff was passed out in the corner looking like he'd just had the life sucked out of him, and Alina Lise was circling the room trying to come up with excuses why she couldn't go anymore. For some reason, whatever she just did with Cliff was enough to change her mind and make her not want to go anymore. She couldn't bear the thought of having to leave him for 2 whole years like that. It was only after Rudy revealed it would actually be something more like 4 months that Alina Lise would change her mind again. Now, a 4-month journey was definitely way more manageable for Cliff, but because it was unlikely that he could keep the teleporters a secret, Rudy figured it was best to keep him behind this time. If things did somehow turn out so bad that they needed even more reinforcements though, then Rudy thought they could just teleport back and bring even more people. It was back home with Sylphie that things were pretty much the same, but we did get to see the types of names that Rudy had in mind for his kids. It was Ciel and Sion for if it was a girl, then Nero and Wallachia for a boy. All references to Melty Blood, which to Rudy on second thought probably wasn't the best idea. What he came up with after was something a bit more normal like Sirius or Lucy. As for why naming them before leaving was such a death flag, it all stemmed from that childhood story with Perugius. You see, one of Perugius's companions decided to name his unborn son before leaving for war, and despite the man's nickname being Fortunate Man, his skills as an Emperor tier fire mage wasn't enough to beat the Demon King Reiner Kaisel. So, unfortunately, this fortunate man died before meeting his son, and it became a well-known story which brought a lot of superstition with it, one that most people believed to be a curse. Fast forward now to the day of travel, and the route Rudy planned was pretty much this. After finding the ruins and using the teleporter, they'd spend a week heading north getting to Bazaar, then once there find a guide and hire them as an escort to Rapon. The toughest part was actually that initial 1-week journey, since not only did Rudy not have a map guiding them to Bazaar, but Nanahoshi mentioned how the route was incredibly exhausting. So much so that she actually had to be carried by Orsted when she was traveling it herself. Luckily, Alina Lise was confident in her innate elven sense of direction, so getting lost wasn't something either would have to worry about. It was kind of like a special ability which let her traverse unfamiliar terrain with ease. This was exemplified clearly in the forest, since what Rudy estimated would take 2 days at least, Alina Lise was able to do in only half. Despite this being a dense woodland where even the best rangers were known to get lost, somehow Alina Lise knew exactly where to find these ruins. It was while doing so that the two would proceed in their standard adventurer formation, and that was basically Alina Lise scouting in front and Rudy supporting from the back. Whatever monsters were spotted in the distance were immediately dispatched by Rudy before they could even realize that the two of them were there. It was an extremely efficient method of traversal that minimized any and all danger around them. It was once they had finally found the ruins after that the symbol marking its location could be identified as the Dragon Gods. It was rather similar to the one he found in the basement, but upon closer inspection you can tell that it's actually different. Perhaps a representation of a different dragon or a connection of the dragon god to whoever made the robot, but to me this other symbol seemed more representative of a phoenix. Either way, since the way the stone worked seemed very similar to that of a magic implement, Rudy figured breaking it open would reveal the same complex magic circles as the ones from any other magic tool. The incantation seemed part of a bigger spell as well, so Rudy wondered if learning the full one would grant him the ability to dispel barriers of any kind. I mean, as a spell most likely created by the dragon god himself, Rudy was eager to try and learn more about it. Unfortunately, any additional research would probably anger Orsted, so avoiding that was priority over everything. Rudy and Alina Lise would then approach the ruins like they would a labyrinth, mainly because the entrance to it seemed very familiar to one. This included clearing each room like it was a tactical FPS game, then carefully taking each step so as to not trigger any floor traps. It was basically Alina Lise in front leading the way and Rudy at the back supporting with his eye of foresight. Of course, there wasn't anything to worry about other than Orsted, since around the ruins were footsteps clearly belonging to him. It made Rudy worried he could show up at any second, but given the unlikelihood of such an occurrence, he knew such worries were mostly unwarranted. It did, however, bring up the question of what they should do about their own footsteps, since if Orsted's could be seen, then theirs probably would too. Rudy thought maybe he should just leave a note or something, but that would only guarantee that Orsted knew he was there. The alternative was to just do nothing, and that was what felt best since there was a chance Orsted would never find out he was here. There was no telling when Orsted would ever come back to these ruins, so surely the passage of time would cover up their presence for them. Now, teleportation felt something like waking up from a nap, and though the entire process seemed as if it was instant, the delay between jumps was more like 7 minutes or so. Rudy had waited for AniNews for 15 minutes in total, so that meant there was a travel time of 7.5 minutes. It was a phenomenon corroborated by the teleportation incident back in Fatoa, since the people affected by that reported odd delays between when they disappeared and reappeared. Another feat that stood out about this teleportation was the way the magic circle kept itself active all the time. It appeared ready to go no matter what the circumstances were, and that made Rudy wonder where it was getting its power from. There didn't seem to be any magic crystals nearby powering it, so the only thing he could think of was that it was absorbing mana from the air or getting powered from something underneath it. Either way, whatever feat of magic was allowing this circle to stay continuously active was invaluable information Rudy definitely wanted to know about. Now, this is the point where the anime starts to speed things up, since a journey which could have been one entire episode was instead condensed down to 7 minutes of seemingly standard adventure stuff. In reality, there was a lot more encounters with monsters, and even 2 extra chapters involving new characters and an ambush by bandits. The whole point was to bring up Rudy's mindset when it came to killing, and pretty much highlight how when fighting people, that was never really an option for him. It was kinda like its own consolidated side story similar to that of Rudy's adventures with Counter Arrow. I won't be going in depth into those chapters right now, but what you need to know is how Rudy's journey was broken up into 2 legs. The first was the 1-week trek from the ruins to the oasis town Bazaar, and the second was the 2-week expedition from Bazaar to Rapan. The anime combined both together to get through things faster, and in the process removed that second leg involving the new characters and bandits. There was quite a bit left out from the first leg too, and that's pretty much what I'll be focusing on now. So, the first night was spent staying in the ruins. Rudy wasn't sure how cold the desert got at night, and with the sun clearly getting close to setting, he figured it was best to wait it out and find out while they still had shelter. It was that same night that the incident with the succubus would happen, and this would be Rudy's wake-up call to be more careful. You see, with the last few years being spent in a safe and civilized university town, Rudy realized his senses were nowhere near what they used to be. He'd clearly gotten too comfortable living the way he had, and now his experience as an adventurer wasn't as refined as it used to be. So, getting more in tune was definitely proving to be a challenge, but more than anything it was the terrain and weather. Luckily, AniNews was handling all the directions, but even just keeping up was proving to be a challenge for him. He'd wanted to create a rainstorm and make things easier, but with every monster always looking for water, doing that would just result in them getting surrounded. Monsters here did have a weakness to cold though, so if they ever did find themselves in a situation like that, Rudy knew he could just freeze the air around them and capitalize on their susceptibility to that. Another solution for the heat that Rudy came up with instead was to create pockets of cold air and decrease the temperature around him. Just like how he created pockets of heat in Renoa, Rudy was just doing the opposite and cooling things down instead. It did only decrease the temperature by about 5 degrees Celsius though, so while it did make things a bit more manageable, it was still brutally hot to the point that fatigue was constantly creeping up on him. Only after freezing his canteen and putting it under his robe did Rudy find the journey became a bit more tolerable. AniNews, on the other hand, didn't seem fazed at the slightest, and Rudy believed that was probably because of her battle aura. In any case, the first monster they would come across would be the Scorpion, and this was a creature comparable to the monsters in the Demon Continent. It was a not-so-pleasant surprise given how everyone always said the Demon Continent was more dangerous, but perhaps the area they were in was just especially dangerous. The next monster was significantly easier, and this was a simple spiky green cactus treant. A minor threat due to its ability to shoot needles and use earth magic, but aside from that, it wasn't very challenging. After that was a giant sandworm, and while yes it was big enough to swallow him and AniNews whole, they weren't very hard to deal with since Rudy could just turn the sand they were hiding in into a blender. That's right, through skillful manipulation of the sand around the worm, he was able to harden it into blades, then churn it around them and shred them to pieces. Quite a creative way of dealing with them if you ask me, and one I'm surprised he just doesn't use for every enemy they come across. The next monsters were by far the most dangerous, and these were a massive army of phalanx ants. It was a line of thousands spreading across the horizon, and they were well known to eat anything and everything they came across. By themselves, they weren't very powerful at all, but as a group they were easily an S-rank threat. Their insatiable appetite meant they'd consume anything, and as a mutated version of the less threatening army ants, they were easily the most ferocious predator currently out here. So, whether they were dealing with stray dragons or humans, these ants could surround anything with their massive numbers, then eventually overcome them no matter how powerful. That's why Lise knew it was best to just hide from them, and that's exactly what they did for over an hour. It was while they waited that Rudy would actually try to figure out a way to beat them, but no matter what he came up with, it just didn't seem effective enough. A massive nuke would likely cause crossfire, and something that didn't kill all of them at once would just result in them getting surrounded. So for now it seemed as if this was an enemy perhaps Rudy couldn't beat. It was once that was done that the two would come across yet another succubus, and this time its approach was slightly different. It had used giant bats to form a wall and separate Lise, then took that opportunity to approach Rudy while he was isolated. Luckily, Rudy was able to set off a stone cannon before she got too close, but because of her resemblance to that of a human, he couldn't find it in him to use full power. At the last second, he dialed it back and, in the end, hit her with a non-lethal attack. Lise would finish her off instead, and once again, Rudy would have to detoxify himself from the succubus's poisons. Unlike how last time Lise was able to restrain herself from Rudy's advances though, it seemed her willpower was starting to crumble a bit. She was quite clearly getting flustered by what Rudy was doing, and that was indication that they needed to find a brothel soon. Shortly after, they would then be attacked by velociraptors, and this was a battle which brought the attention of Garudas. Giant chickens I imagine are similar to Philo, and also the natural predators to these raptors. Lise would use the chaos to slip away from the fight, which was pretty good timing since she also sensed that something bigger was coming their way. So all in all, this was every monster they came across on day one. It was a relentless onslaught that made the demon continent seem like a cakewalk. Sure, the monsters there were far more powerful, but while traveling with Ruijerd, they were never attacked this much. I mean, what Rudy did today felt like a week over there. The second day brought with it even more monsters, and there was actually an incident where Rudy got swallowed by a sandworm. He was caught off guard while fighting a scorpion, and this gave the worm the opportunity to get the jump on him. Luckily, he was able to cast magic from within the worm, and this allowed him to crawl out after killing it from the inside. Unfortunately, Rudy getting swallowed also broke Lise's concentration, and this resulted in her getting poisoned by the scorpion. So it was a near-death experience for both of them, but one that was simply a matter of being unlucky, not unexperienced. Later that day was when they saw the behemoth too, and this was a peaceful giant that only attacked when attacked first. It was quite the anomaly in terms of presence and behavior, since despite their size, no one has ever found one of their corpses before. There was a group of adventurers that said they had managed to kill one, but that was only a rumor making it seem like it was possible. No one was actually sure whether that was true or not, but Lise believed that if anyone could do it, then it was probably Rudy. Day 3 was when they encountered their first sandstorm, but what Rudy initially thought was just a regular weather phenomenon instead seemed more like a barrier due to its unnatural properties. The first was the way it acted like a stationary wall of sand, and the second was how after he'd cleared it via magic, it had returned less than an hour later exactly where it was before. It made him think that this was perhaps some sort of natural-looking defense that blocked the route to Orsted's ruins. It was from this point on that the monsters they encountered were far less dangerous and frequent, so days 4 and 5 dealt mainly with griffins. By now, Lise couldn't control herself at all though, so when Rudy had held her as they ascended to the top of the cliff face, the very act of him touching her unleashed everything she was trying to hold back. The griffins would attack before anything would happen though, and the rest was a relatively incident-free journey all the way to Bazaar. There were a few more fights with some families of griffins, but that was because the area they were cutting through was a griffin nesting ground. This provided a pretty good source of food for them, since the younger the griffin, the more tender the meat. So much so that they had actually chosen to eat the child griffin over the mother or father. Episode 44, Into the Labyrinth, covering chapters 1 to 4 from volume 12 of the light novel. To start things off with a bit of lore, Rapan wasn't always the most prominent city in Begarit. Before it was just a small oasis, but after a chain reaction of events, it had become this bustling hub for fame-seeking adventurers. What particular series of events caused it to take off then? Well, it all stems back to how these massive bones got here. You see, this was once a behemoth causing havoc in the area up until the North god Kalman came and defeated it. I know I said no person had ever witnessed one being slain before, but for a powerful warrior who's defeated an immortal demon king and dragons alike, a simple behemoth was probably nothing for him. So, Kalman came, feasted on the behemoth, then left, and what was left behind was nothing but a rotting carcass, one that would eventually attract all sorts of monsters. Of those, ants were a good number of the monsters that had come to feast too, and it was their tunnels that would create the numerous labyrinths surrounding Rapan. They had come in droves to take part in what was essentially free food, then created nests nearby so that they could continue to take part. The thing about monsters eating the flesh of other stronger monsters though is that the resulting offspring will usually be mutated. So these ants who had an endless supply of food from the strongest monster in the desert were now giving birth to mutated kin who would also eat the behemoth flesh. Continue this cycle for a few more generations, and the expansive nests which now spread across the area as the labyrinths we see today also became home to powerful mutated offspring. It was the #1 attraction for adventurers across the world. Each labyrinth was a potential treasure trove of riches, and the fact there were so many meant adventurers could tackle multiple. It was the perfect place to either get rich quick or come face to face with tragedy. Now, Rudy wasn't so sure that the monster meat theory was true or not, but it did make sense with regards to the demon continent. You see, there monster meat was the only thing to eat, and it just so happened that a higher rate of strong people were born there. This made Rudy wonder if his child would turn out freakishly strong because of that, since he himself had eaten so much monster meat when he was traveling there. In any case, a short walk would bring Rudy and Alina Lise to the guild, and it was here that he would find Geese struggling to find help to save Roxy. The guy he was talking to was supposedly some really strong adventurer, but no matter what Geese offered, it wasn't enough to face the certain death which came with traversing the teleportation labyrinth. He had made comments about it already being a month, which was the first hint Geese wasn't referring to Zenith. Geese was still adamant about at least finding Roxy's remains, but once again, Budget Otar said no. The reason I'm reiterating such a point is because the desperate expressions Geese was making was far different from the ones that Rudy was familiar with. Rudy didn't even know that such a face was possible for him, but according to Alina Lise, that was actually more his standard look. It seemed whatever time Rudy spent with him back in the forest was actually just Geese trying to act more mature for him. Geese would then bring Rudy to Paul, and what Rudy was expecting was a Paul similar to how he was back in Millis. A broken man, frustrated to no end, running away from his problems via bottles of alcohol. What he saw was instead a person far more tame, but deep in Paul's eyes was nothing but emptiness. He was this hollow shell in which all emotion was absent. Sure, he was going through the motions and asking Rudy how he was doing, but the way he did just seemed lifeless. It was a pitiful display that made the entire journey worth it already. Even if Paul's spirit was broken for good, Rudy was going to do everything he could to make things better. He truly believed that he could fix everything. It was as soon as Rudy had mentioned his child, though, that life immediately returned back to Paul's eyes. Whatever concerns Rudy had before were seemingly unwarranted since Paul was actually just half asleep. He had thought the Rudy in front of him was nothing but a dream, thus the distant question and answers. Paul would then ask Rudy about his life right there and then, and Rudy would recount everything up until his marriage. The thing about a conversation like that, though, was that there was a constant fear that Paul would react similarly to last time. Unless he spoke super objectively and chose his words carefully, Rudy was worried Paul might have another one of his jealousy-driven outbursts. Hiding his happiness turned out to be a bit more difficult than Rudy imagined, though, since the more he spoke of his time in Renoa, the more he realized he had nothing but good memories there. There were certainly times when things were tough, but as he remembered all that happened with Sylphie and everyone else, he truly believed he was having the time of his life there. So much so that hiding that fact was just impossible. It was once he finished that Rudy was expecting a stern scolding, but instead Paul simply responded with an apology. He truly felt remorse for removing Rudy from his life this way. This definitely came as a surprise, since Rudy was sure the implication of him sleeping with someone while Paul couldn't would 100% trigger at least some sort of reaction. I mean, Paul did promise to wait until he saved Zenith, so Rudy couldn't even imagine the pain of not doing it for over 6 years now. That's when he found out he did get it on with Lilia once though, but the reason for that was simply because they were attacked by a succubus. A reasonable excuse, since I'm sure you don't need me to describe how depraved a lust-driven Paul would be. Yes, they did have a healer capable of detoxification magic, but with Paul acting the way he was, the physical touch necessary to cast such magic would be way too dangerous for her. Lilia would volunteer to take one for the team instead, and that's how the two ended up doing it together. Now, that's not to say that was a bad thing though, since Lilia and Paul are technically officially married too. It's just Paul did promise to wait until he saved Zenith before doing it again. Aside from that, there was a quick mention of Talhand not being affected by the succubus's poison, and that relates to the reason why he was staring at Rudy's ass later. But going back to Paul and Rudy, Paul would actually comment on how Rudy sounded more confident. It was one of the many signs that he had grown, and that was enough to make him cry even more. Rudy would then embrace Paul himself, and as soon as he realized he no longer had to reach to wrap his arms around him, that's when Rudy would start crying too. Their years apart had just become so much more apparent to each other. It was after this that Paul would confront Alina Lise, but no context behind their beef was given in the novels either. The whole matter was resolved so quickly though that Rudy was starting to wonder if it was actually just something very trivial. Now, to give a bit more context behind the whole Zenith situation, the wording they used to describe it was captured. This was a strange choice since that could imply multiple things, but more than anything, Rudy was confused as to who or what would be holding Zenith captive for 6 long years now. Like, it probably wasn't a person if it was in the depths of the labyrinth, and the notion of it being the labyrinth itself wasn't something Rudy knew was even possible. Supposedly a party that went in mentioned seeing someone who resembled Zenith, but that party hasn't been heard from since the last time they went in. And that was information Geese had acquired almost 4 years ago. The reason they could still continue searching with the hopes that she was alive now was mostly because of the information that Roxy came with. You see, after hearing from Kashirika that Zenith was alive 2 years ago, it was more than likely that she was still alive now. If she was able to survive that 2-year gap between when she went missing and when Kashirika found her, then it's definitely probable she could have gone another 2 years just fine. This was why Geese was so certain they could still find Zenith, despite him being all doom and gloom for the Roxy situation. Talhand would then come in shortly after this, and Alina Lise would deliver a warning about how Rudy needed to be careful around him. Apparently, he stole what men held most dear. Of course, Rudy had no idea what she was talking about, but I'm sure you can make your own assumptions based on the detail with the succubus before. Now, the news about Roxy was actually more shocking than the news of Zenith, since while Rudy had 6 years to mentally prepare for Zenith's potential death, there was nothing which helped him to prepare for that scenario with Roxy. It was an abrupt revelation that left him stunned. Fortunately, he wasn't so naive as to devolve into panic, since while yes, he wanted nothing more than to leave right away and go save her, he knew more than anything the most important step right now was careful preparation. Sure, time was definitely of the essence, but to rush into the labyrinth without any plan whatsoever, well, that could very well be the difference between life and death for Roxy. So, Rudy would confirm the situation as best he could, then reveal the book which would help them adequately prepare. I had talked about this back in episode 5, so I'll include that segment about the book's contents now just in case you forgot about it. The book was a creative non-fiction that told the tale of Animus's exploration of the teleportation labyrinth. With the labyrinth housing traps only related to teleportation, the actual traversal of it became rather difficult. It was from what Animus and his companions could find that they were able to narrow the traps down into 3 broad categories. The first was a one-way teleporter that sent people to the same fixed location, the second a reciprocal teleporter that led to a magic circle allowing for teleportation back, then the third a random teleporter which, well, could take you anywhere. All of which had a good chance to send you straight to a pack of monsters, since the creatures inhabiting this labyrinth were both intelligent and cunning. Not only did they understand the labyrinth's complex layout, but they also knew where every teleporter would send someone, often waiting at the destination to hunt whoever it was that was using them. In any case, it was after Animus had found a way to determine which teleporters were reciprocal and which were not that he would only use reciprocals to bring himself deeper. The plan itself was working rather fine, but it was a single misstep that would cause him to use a random one by accident. A fatal mistake that would cause him to lose his entire party and one of his arms. Fortunately, he survived, but with no way to defend himself in the labyrinth anymore, he decided to leave the conquering of it to the reader. Thus the reason he had written this book. Now, it was possible this book pertained to a completely different teleportation labyrinth, so naturally it was best to evaluate whether that was true or not. If you're wondering why Geese was the person to do that, well, Rudy wasn't quite sure himself, but it was clear by everyone's reactions that he was the person responsible for this type of stuff. He seemed to be this Flex-type member responsible for everything that wasn't battle. This included anything from mapping and directions, all the way to managing supplies, choosing what drops to take, and even how to extract them. He was both the commander and the errand boy, the group's manager, planner, and coordinator. He would even be the one to decide whether it was best to retreat or not. So, given that this was his role, it made sense that he would be the one to sift through the book's information like that. It was while he did that Rudy would ask Paul 4 key questions about the labyrinth. What were the monsters? How many floors were there? What was the interior like, and what were the shape of the teleportation circles? The monsters were divided into 5 main types, and these were giant poisonous tarantulas capable of projectiles, tank-like caterpillars with sturdy defenses, human-shaped mud creatures intelligent enough to cast magic, armored warriors similar to these guys from Elden Ring, then the devouring devil, which was a beast with long limbs and knife-like claws and fangs. There was an unknown number of floors leading to the bottom, but the most reliable rumor was that it was something like 6 or 7. Of course, since no one had actually reached the bottom, the labyrinth's guardian was just as much of a mystery as the depths itself. They did, however, know what enemies to expect on each floor, since the deeper you went, the more dangerous they got. So, floor 1 was only spiders. Floor 2 both spiders and caterpillars. Floor 3 the mud skulls, which exhibited command over the monsters before. Floor 4 only mud skulls and armored warriors. Floor 5 only armored warriors and devouring devils, then Floor 6 devouring devils alone. The reason the labyrinth follows this type of hierarchy is because the first 3 floors were part of those ant nests I had mentioned earlier, and Floor 4 and below were ancient ruins that somehow became connected to it. So, whereas the initial floors are complex winding pathways with rooms connected to them, the later floors were more of what you'd expect from a dungeon. Clear paths and hallways with larger rooms branching off from them. Now, the teleporter shape was no different from the one Rudy knew himself, so that only provided confirmation for what Rudy already suspected. It was once that confirmation was made that a proper formation would then be decided upon. AniNews would be the party's tank, Paul the secondary DPS alongside Talhan secondary DPS and the occasional off-tank, then Rudy the primary DPS and primary healer. These 4 would be in charge of combat, and Geese would handle everything else. Talhan's role was a bit more vague than everyone else's though, since while he was an all-purpose fighter capable of close quarters combat, he was also a magician capable of intermediate tier earth magic. That being the case, his position was one in which he could always do both. He would hover around Rudy and cast magic if need be, or step up to the front and join the fight as well. It really just depended on what the circumstances called for. As for Lilia, Viera, and Shiera, their job was to simply house sit. Since Rudy and AniNews were the replacements for them, they were now tasked with making sure the group had somewhere to come back to. An important job that pretty much every large clan had someone do. The preparations were then done mostly by AniNews or Talhan, but if there was ever a time where Rudy felt his knowledge would be helpful, he figured he would only mention it as a suggestion. Perhaps his experience playing roguelike RPGs could actually be useful, but considering the others were all real-life veterans, Rudy figured it was best to leave everything to them. So, the plan as of now was to get to the 3rd floor and rescue Roxy, then retreat immediately after and see if she was good enough to regroup and go save Zenith. It was a fairly straightforward set of objectives that Rudy assumed would become long and complicated. He honestly had no idea how long any of this would actually take. This brings us now to his conversations at night, and aside from Lilia asking about Aisha and Paul talking about his proclivities, there was an interesting cutscene involving Rudy thinking about the man god. He was lying in bed trying to concentrate, and it was as he did that he wondered if this was what the man god wanted all along. I mean, had he not told Rudy to go to Renoa and study teleportation, then he wouldn't have found this book, which would conveniently turn out to be so helpful in challenging the labyrinth. It was clear the man god's words always hid some sort of deeper meaning, and his last conversation was certainly no exception to that. This brought into question why the man god would suggest the ridiculous things that he did, and the only answer Rudy could come up with was that he was purposefully trying to agitate him. It was as if the man god knew Rudy was trying to be rebellious, and as a way to counter that, he did a bit of reverse psychology. This was confirmed by Rudy saying he would have done the opposite regardless of what the man god said, so had he told him to go to Begarit and leave Sylphie instead, then he 100% would have stayed behind and sent someone else. So, now that the man god had shown yet again his words were to Rudy's benefit, it made Rudy think that perhaps the man god just truly enjoyed watching him. He had no clue what was going on in his head, but considering how at every step he's always been incredibly helpful, Rudy could no longer deny the fact that he was genuinely an ally to him. He did after all send him to the one place that had everything he needed to save Zenith. Fast forward now to the day of the rescue, and Rudy's spirit scrolls would turn out to be far more useful than you may think. Not only did it mean that Paul and Geese didn't have to carry torches, but the light was brighter and lasted longer. Even if the user had summoned it with the fraction of the mana that Rudy did, it would still more than likely last the length of an expedition. More than anything, freeing up a hand was invaluable, so these lamplight scrolls could very well put torches out of the market if Rudy wanted to. So Geese had one to himself 10 steps ahead of the group, while the other hovered by Lise and Paul as they followed behind. The special shoe he wore made identifying his footsteps easier, and the general rule was to follow them precisely. Now, the first floor was, as I said, tarantulas, and their innate knowledge of the labyrinth inadvertently identified where traps were. We saw this in this scene here, since the way they avoided it indicated it was a trap. Rookie adventurers would see it as a way to avoid stepping on the spiders, but in actuality it was a one-way ticket to getting teleported. Paul would typically be the one to dispatch these spiders, and the weapons he used were both familiar and unfamiliar. His main hand carried the sword he trained with all the time back in Fatoa, while his offhand was a sword too long to be called short and too short to be called long. It was a completely different type of weapon that Rudy had never seen before. Paul wasn't really using it much to fight at all though, so Rudy wondered if it was just there to look cool or something. Now, Lise's reveal about Paul being her son was actually something that got way more of a reaction from him. The moment he heard that she was now family, he immediately broke formation, went to Rudy and verified it. The news of Laws being her son came as quite the shock to him. All that stuff aside though, it took 5 hours and 5 teleporters to get down to the second floor. Each teleporter led to a path to another teleporter, and the time it took to get between them was about 1 hour. Occasionally there'd be 2 teleporters side by side, but Geese had marked the right ones beforehand. The second floor brought with it a new enemy, and these iron crawlers worked together with the spiders. The spiders would immobilize their targets from a distance, then iron crawlers would trample them using their 1-ton bodies and heavy defenses. They weren't so tough that Rudy couldn't take care of them, but unlike the spiders, these iron crawlers weren't an enemy Paul could one-shot anymore. They're actually the reason why they couldn't make it very far without Roxy on their team. The iron crawlers were just an extremely bad matchup for them. Now that Rudy was here, things were a whole lot easier, so not only was this their easiest expedition yet, but Tallhand even found himself bored since there wasn't anything for him to do anymore. He was literally on standby while Rudy cleaned up everything. This would lead to him becoming the lookout while everyone was on break, and it was while on break that Geese would talk with Rudy. He wanted to know, based on the rough maps he put together, where Rudy's intuition might think Roxy was. The map showed where they'd been and where they've searched before, so it was based on that Rudy would point to an empty spot east of where they were. A brand new area yet to be searched that Rudy honestly just picked at random. It was a good distance away from the trap that had teleported her, so it seemed like a good place to start rather than searching everywhere. That's when the group would head to floor 3, and almost immediately after entering, he would smell something familiar. It was a presence he would never mistake for anything else, and 100% proof that Roxy was close. That's when the novel switches over to Roxy's perspective, and it actually explains how it is she survived so long. Well, we only saw very little of what she actually went through, but a large part of it was a safe zone she managed to constantly find her way back to. It was a grueling struggle in which the more she tried to escape, the harder the journey became and the closer to despair she got. The way she survived wasn't so much about the survival itself though, but rather the way in which she overcame it. What I mean is that, as a lone mage in an extremely desperate situation, the mental part of it was just as important as the physical. Seeing her come to terms with what seemed like imminent death really highlighted some parts of Roxy we haven't yet seen before, and that's the parts I want to share with you today. So, as we go through how it is Roxy survived in the labyrinth, you'll get to see more this determined part of her that's intent on living. If we're gonna understand exactly what it is Roxy went through, then it's important to set the stage for where exactly she found herself. You see, this area here was actually one of two places she constantly found herself coming back to. The other was a small room which acted as her safe zone, and both were constant in an endless loop where escape was impossible. In fact, if Roxy was to make it back to the main path where everyone else was, she would first have to traverse over 30 one-way teleporters in perfect order without messing up once. It was pretty much like winning 30 coin flips in a row. Perhaps even harder since some rooms had more than one teleporter in them. That being the case, to say she was trapped was more like an understatement, and it all happened due to one simple misstep. She was evading an attack directed straight towards her, and right as she stepped back in order to do so, she clumsily tripped and landed right onto a magic circle. It was a rookie mistake since she'd even reviewed where all the traps were beforehand. This brought her to a den filled with monsters, and it was actually the same one we saw her fighting in at the end of last episode. You may be wondering how she was there for an entire month, but I promise it'll all make sense once you understand the loop part of everything. So, while yes, where she was teleported and where she was found was one and the same, it's not exactly where she spent all her time. She was able to clear the initial wave that was waiting for her, then right as the next batch teleported in, she noticed one of the 6 teleporters around her wasn't being used by them. This made her wonder if monsters weren't at the other side of it, and sure enough, her assumption was right. So, after fighting her way over and teleporting again, what Roxy found on the other side was a small, cramped area just tall enough for her to stand up in and only long enough for 1 or 2 people to lie down in. It was an enclosed space where the only other thing present was a single teleporter. A mini bunker too small for monsters to teleport into, and one in which she would remain safe so long as she stayed. The teleporter next to her was one of the random ones, so this meant it could take her anywhere. Whether it be a den full of monsters or another narrow passageway, finding out was a risk that meant accepting that same danger of before all over again. Luckily, she could recoup her mana and rest without worry, but if she wanted to escape, this was the only way out. Now, mana and water were the things that she had an abundant supply of, but food was the one provision which was limited. She did pack enough to survive more than a few days, but just surviving wasn't what she had planned for herself. No, Roxy was very intent on escaping. As much as she wanted to think Paul and the others were coming to save her, there was a whole plethora of reasons why they couldn't. And it was that realization that helped her to steel her resolve and continue forward. So, after spending a day in the bunker, Roxy would take her chances with random teleportation and commence the loop which she would cycle through over and over again. She would find herself in an unfamiliar passageway, hop on whatever one-way teleporters seemed safe, then mark every area to the best of her ability. Of course, as it is when dealing with this labyrinth, it was impossible to get your bearings no matter how skilled you were. Eventually, the journey would always just devolve into hopping on a teleporter and hoping to see something different. Unfortunately, Roxy wasn't so lucky, and it was after teleporting over and over again that she would once again be faced with the horde of monsters in the same den from last time. She immediately recognized the unused teleporter at the back, then fought her way to safety just as she did before, bringing her right back to the bunker where she was however many hours or days ago. Roxy would then rest another day and venture out again, only to repeat the same process and end up right back here. It seemed whatever route of teleporters she took, they would always lead back to the den and subsequently this small little bunker, resulting in an endless loop that got harder the more times she did it. So, as her body became exhausted and her food supplies low, eventually she had to start eating monster meat. The thing about these types of monsters though was that their flesh was so incredibly toxic, the only way to eat them was to first detoxify them. This was how Roxy took care of her food problems, and it was to say the least taking its toll on her. What worried her more than the hunger, the tiredness, and the overall sense of dread though was the thought of having to go back through the teleporter and do it all over again. You see, knowing what it was that awaited her on the outside was finally starting to make Roxy feel like she couldn't do it anymore. I mean, these were by no means your average monsters. They were intelligent to the point that they could coordinate and work together, so it was just a matter of time until they would adapt and find a way to beat Roxy, especially if she kept approaching and escaping the exact same way she did the last 5 or 10 times. A month of on and off combat was ample time for any opponent to adapt. So, because Roxy knew her enemies were waiting and learning, she was terrified by the thought of finally being overcome by them. She knew they knew that she was trapped, and it was for that reason that she felt like death was right around the corner for her. It was a terrible feeling that shook her all the way down to her core. Yes, time and time again she'd seen adventurers meet their end, yet no matter how much that reminded her her fate was going to be the same, she still found herself frightened by the thought of being on its doorstep. As much as she wanted to think that she was prepared for it, there was still so much more that she wanted to do with her life. Dreams that filled her with regret for not having achieved them yet. She still wanted to teach despite having no talent for it, and she still wanted to fall in love despite thinking she wasn't the most appealing. That's why after she'd finished saving Zenith, she was planning to go back to the university and become a professor there. She'd reacquaint herself with the master she had a falling out with, then perhaps find a person she could fall in love with. It was nothing more than a simple happiness she'd always envisioned for herself. But now that death was only 1 or 2 teleportation circles away, the only thing Roxy could think of was how her dreams won't come true anymore. She could only imagine just how terrible her death was going to be, and that brought with it a slippery slope straight into despair. Even so, it's because she didn't want to die and really wanted to live that Roxy would muster up the courage to get up and leave her bunker again. She would step foot back into that teleportation circle and continue traversing that same unfamiliar passageway she'd come through all those times before. A few new circles would then lead her right back to where she expected, and once again Roxy would be face to face with that same den of monsters. This time things were a little bit different though, since now that Roxy had been here almost 10 times, the monsters knew how it was she was getting away from them. They identified the teleporter she kept using to escape, then used the corpses of the monsters she slaughtered to block her access to it. The hundreds of monsters she wiped out on all her previous trips were now piled into a mountain, creating this impassable barricade. So, if Roxy wanted to escape this time, not only would she have to kill all the monsters currently present, but she would also have to remove the wall of corpses currently blocking her exit. It was a near impossible task given the army-like formation the monsters were operating with. Remember how I said these monsters were intelligent? Well, aside from being smart enough to block Roxy's exit, they were also coordinated enough to prepare this incredible siege. They had put iron crawlers in the front to act as defense, the spiders behind to provide offensive support, then the mudskulls in the back for that long-range damage. It was impeccable organization only possible on this floor of the labyrinth. All this still wouldn't have been enough to take out Roxy, but because more monsters kept teleporting in, there wasn't enough time to recoup, let alone make progress on the barricade. The monsters had made it so that there was no escaping back to her bunker this time. That's when Roxy would start to get overwhelmed, and shortly after would come the part where her life would flash before her eyes. It was a genuinely interesting moment that shed a bit of light into who she is and what she perceives as the core memories in her life. A deeper look into the defining moments of her character and how she feels about them. So, the first would be the disappointment of her parents, and this was when they first realized that she couldn't communicate like them. They did eventually teach her how to speak, but to her she felt they only did so out of pity. It was a bit later that a traveling magician would leave a deep impression on her, and this was what would spark her interest in magic. So eventually she would learn how to use basic tier water magic, then leave the village and join her first adventurer party. The 4 of them would travel together for years, but as soon as one ended up dying, the rest would disband and Roxy would go to the central continent. It was here she would enroll into the University of Magic and for the first time be exposed to a school environment. It was a whole new experience she'd never known before, yet one she became quite fond of since things were nice. Her grades were good and she was perceived as talented, but more than anything she'd developed an ego. You see, after finding her master and learning Saint tier water magic, the speed in which she picked it up led to her thinking she was amazing. Her master would then complain about how prideful she was, and that wasn't something Roxy was particularly fond of. So she would leave after graduating without saying anything, then set out for Asura and try to find work. What she thought would be incredibly easy though, instead turned out to be quite the opposite. As it turns out, for whatever reason, a mage like her just wasn't employable. She would then be forced to move out to the countryside, but even there, still no one wanted to hire her. That's when she would spot the ad for a home tutor in Fatoa, and just like that, Roxy would be introduced to Rudy. A period in time in which she would be humbled by Rudy's own talent. It definitely did create this growing sense of envy, but at the same time, his own modest behavior made her respect him. It was after that she would head to Shirane, explore labyrinths just on the outskirts, then teach Pax to no success whatsoever. It was an experience that showed her just how bad she was at teaching, while at the same time highlighted just how amazing Rudy was. Then, once her job became too disgusting to bear, she immediately left and met up with AniNews and Tallhand, a result of finding out about the displacement incident. The three would then travel to the Demon Continent, meet up with Roxy's parents where she could confirm that they really did love her, then encounter Kashirika and find out about Zenith. These were the memories Roxy recounted all in this instant, and they reminded her even more of why she wanted to live. So, as she thought relentlessly about how she didn't want to die, the last thing she would think of was actually of how she wouldn't be able to see her parents anymore. It's what I assume is the biggest regret of her life, since in her final moments it's what her mind came to first. Of course, that's when Rudy would come in and save her, and that's how Roxy survived the labyrinth. It wasn't so much this struggle to find resources and survive, but rather this exercise in perseverance and determination. She very well could have spent weeks on end inside her little bunker, but instead chose to venture out and continue fighting. It's an interesting tale of survival that I think tells a lot about Roxy, one that I felt deserved its own video. Luckily, the cut content from last episode wasn't actually very much, but there is one thing that I feel is worth mentioning. It's that Rudy didn't actually know how he figured out where Roxy was. Yes, he did mention how he smelled her, but that feeling of imminent danger which he also felt alongside it was something more than just intuition. Had he not felt that she was in danger like the way he did, then he wouldn't have torn down wall after wall to get to her, and by the time he found her, he would have been too late. It was a case of convenient timing that Rudy couldn't just consider lucky. Perhaps it was in fact the bond he'd made with her, or perhaps it was something more like the man god intervening. Either way, whether Roxy or the man god, it was for sure some sort of divine intervention. Episode 46, Parents, covering chapters 8 to 11 from volume 12 of the light novel. With the last teleporter being right in front of them, preparation was the most important thing right now. That meant taking stock of supplies, which in turn led Rudy to taking those advanced tier healing scrolls from Roxy. They were an emergency precaution just in case his throat or lungs got crushed like last time. He was also given a magically imbued crystal from AniNews, which was essentially a mana pot for if he or Roxy ran out. It wasn't something Rudy was particularly concerned with, but when exploring a labyrinth, magicians ran out of mana all the time, especially if the boss room was one of the arena types. This meant once you entered, you couldn't leave, so unless you were ready to slay the boss as is, it was always best to ensure you were as prepared as possible for it. Now, aside from the wonder of being face to face with a Hydra, what intrigued Rudy more was the condition of Zenith. It wasn't a worried panic like how we saw with Paul though, but rather a more confused how did she get there type look. His first thoughts weren't of concern or how do we save her, but instead a series of questions asking why. How was it that Zenith ended up inside this crystal, and why was it that she was all the way down here being guarded by this Hydra? It's an interesting perspective I'll get more into soon, but for now all you need to know is that this was what Rudy was thinking about. There were so many doubts behind the plausibility of all this happening by chance. It was before Rudy could express any of them though that Paul would charge in and Rudy be forced to engage. Since he wanted to end the fight in only one hit, what he charged up was a stone cannon on par with this one, a projectile strong enough to obliterate the body of the immortal Demon King. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough to pierce this Hydra's defenses, so as we saw in the anime, the only person capable of that was Paul. His movements were so fast that even Rudy's Eye of Foresight couldn't keep up, and his technique refined to the point that even if he didn't cut through a head in one slice, he would flip his body and use the centrifugal force from it to ensure he made the cut the second time. Both swords seemed perfect for the job, but to add a little context as to why this shorter one was better, it's because it was a magic item imbued with the highly rare steel cutting ability. This meant the harder the exterior of the opponent Paul was up against, the sharper his sword would become and the easier it would be to slice through. It was an amazing weapon that scaled in power proportionally to an enemy's durability. That also meant it was extremely dull when trying to cut softer things, but that's actually the reason why Paul was even able to secure it. You see, when a merchant was demoing it by trying to cut through dried meat, his inability to slice any of it made it seem like the blade was useless. Paul of course recognized it as that extremely rare steel cutting ability, so that was enough for him to step in and purchase it. It was a bargain buy he secured for literal pennies, making it an impressive find whose true value was shining now. Since the Hydra's scales were very clearly tough, that made Paul's sword the perfect tool against them. It's just that at this point there wasn't any strategy, and Paul's reckless behavior was putting his support in danger. The injury she received was actually a lot more sizable than what we saw in the anime, but nothing too severe that basic tier healing magic couldn't fix. From the way Rudy described it, it was a deep laceration that would have required dozens of stitches back in the old world. One that came just from a slight graze with the Hydra's razor-sharp exterior. That made it clear that getting close was dangerous, since if the lightest touch was enough to cut you open, those incapable of defending would be sliced to ribbons. It was an important concern that definitely needed to be discussed, but Paul clearly didn't even register it. His focus on Zenith closed out the fact Alina Lise got hurt, and that didn't really sit too well with Rudy. I mean, yes, she was the party's tank, but just because taking damage was part of the job, that didn't mean that Paul should completely ignore her. It was a state of mind not beneficial to anyone. What bothered Rudy more than that, though, was once again that burning question of why. Reason being that there were quite a few things that just didn't make sense here. Like, even if you set aside the question of why Zenith got imprisoned here, how was it that she was teleported here to begin with, and how did Geese know that this was the condition she was stuck in? The former is a question that ties back to Rudy's research, and the latter refers to the peculiar wording Geese chose to use when describing Zenith. To focus on the former first though, teleportation into a solid object wasn't something easily accomplished. Just like how you can't cast an offensive spell directly within a person's body, to transport a human into the earth itself was just as impossible. There was an insurmountable resistance between the mana at the destination and the mana in the person being teleported, one that made the two wholly incompatible with each other. That didn't mean that it was impossible though, since Rudy did speculate that with an obscene amount of mana, it probably could be done. So, as unlikely as it was for Zenith to be teleported right into this crystal, it wasn't impossible so long as enough mana was used. This makes me wonder whether Zenith was actually teleported here or not, since with her being the only case of teleportation like this, perhaps it wasn't the incident that had sent her here. Perhaps another factor's at play and we're just getting looped in now. Either way, I'm sure it's something that'll be answered later. Now, as for how Geese knew that she was captured like this, well, it was this choice of wording that made him seem suspicious too. What I mean is that it implied he knew this was the state she was in without anyone ever coming here. An impossible scenario considering that no one has made it here. His story was that she was found by adventurers, but if that was true, then how did they get all the way here, make it back, and tell Geese about it? It's pretty obvious that they didn't, so something about the way Geese framed his information just wasn't adding up anymore. It was enough of a mystery that Rudy knew he needed to ask about it later. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see any of that in the anime, but that's the situation as is with all the smaller bits and details. To switch back to the problem at hand now though, the Hydra here wasn't one of the 3 confirmed living versions in the world right now. In the Demon Continent, there was the white, gray, and gold scale ones, but the one guarding Zenith had green scales. It was a fabled monster whose last recorded presence was during the Second Great Human-Demon War. A period of time from over 5,000 years ago. Legends say they were annihilated when the continent was split, but clearly that wasn't true given the one standing right in front of them. So this was a monster Rudy knew him and his party were very much outmatched by. So much so that he actually felt it was best to retreat and create a more specialized party. It was unlikely they'd find anyone whose specialty was the Hydra, but if there was at least one other person who could slice cleanly through the Hydra's neck, that alone would have made the fight significantly easier. It's just too bad that Rudy knew Paul wouldn't allow it. Given the state he was currently in, even if Rudy did leave and took everyone else with him, He knew Paul would have stayed behind and fought the Hydra solo. That's just how committed he was to ending this problem now. So, before we get more into how they're going to handle it, for a bit more context on Rudy's impartial behavior towards Zenith, a large part of it was actually because he'd already given up on her. That's a bit more blunt than how the novel put it, but what Rudy was expecting was literally nothing. He knew the odds of her surviving were minimal to begin with, so in the years she'd been gone, he'd prepared himself for the worst. Like, he didn't expect to find any trace of her, let alone her body. It's how I assume he was able to calmly question whether she was alive or not. This obviously wasn't appropriate given who she was to him, but as we saw in the anime, Zenith was less his mother and more just this person he happened to live with. A likely product of how he perceived interpersonal relationships at the time. Now, the most important thing prior to going back in was determining a formation and setting everyone's roles in it. Reason being that, with Paul being the only one capable of beheading and Rudy being the only one capable of cauterizing, ensuring both could do their jobs uninterrupted was absolutely essential. This meant Alina Lise and Tallhand would have to be decoys and Roxy would need to stay at the back and act as their healer. The result was an arrangement known as the Imperial Cross Formation. In the anime it wasn't so prominent, but as you'll soon see, it's actually a major part in how they were able to defeat the Hydra. They were significantly more organized than how they looked here. To finish off this conversation first though, Paul's statement to Rudy wasn't at all as cruel as you might think it was. As absurd as it is to hear your own parents say to fight to the death, the message being sent wasn't so much the literal words of what he was saying, but rather the genuine conviction behind it. What I mean is that by Paul saying what he did, he was displaying in full the trust he had for Rudy. Since his own determination would have him save Zenith at the cost of his own life, the fact he expected the same from Rudy meant he was thinking of him as an equal here. He was seeing Rudy for the adult he was and showing he believed in him just as much as he believed in himself. A message intent on getting Rudy to share the same determination as his own. He didn't actually want Rudy to die, since to save Zenith and lose Rudy in the process was, in his own words, completely nonsensical. Paul genuinely wanted to save everyone. He just needed Rudy to see how much he respected him first. Now, the anime portrayed the fight amazingly in its own way, but that Imperial Cross Formation wasn't something you'd know they were actively doing. So, it was Paul in front, handling one head at a time, Alina Lise and Tallhand on either side serving as both decoys and defense, Rudy right behind Paul so he could cauterize immediately, then Roxy behind him to provide heals for everyone. It was an optimized formation that took advantage of the Hydra's attack patterns. Since it typically only attacked with 3 heads at a time, this meant Alina Lise and Tallhand could parry one each, then that left the other for Paul and Rudy to handle all on their own. Occasionally it would swing a 4th head just to switch things up, but whether at Alina Lise or Tallhand, 2 heads at once weren't enough to overcome either of them. Even if either did get injured by a mistimed parry, Roxy would just run up, heal them, then return back to her position. They were a well-oiled machine, both highly methodical and organized, one whose sole purpose was to ensure that Rudy was protected. This allowed him to focus only on burning, and while the trust required to do so was immense, by the 3rd head, Rudy knew focusing on anything else was unnecessary. Alina Lise and Tallhand had proven he had nothing to worry about. Any head that got even remotely close was immediately deflected and quickly decapitated. So, for a while this strict regiment was working spectacularly. It was when the group got the Hydra to 5 heads left though that once again it would switch things up. It had decided to attack with all 5 heads at once now, a focused charge directed straight towards Tallhand. He was able to dodge 2 and block another, but by the time the 4th came to attack 2, there was nothing Tallhand could do to defend himself anymore. He was immediately grabbed just like how we saw in the anime, then about to be split in half by the incoming 5th head. Luckily, Paul was there to save him, but that was the real reason why Tallhand got grabbed like that. I assume it's because the Hydra identified him as the weakest. Fast forward now to the Hydra's trump card, and this was an attack known as Dragon's Breath, an ability strong enough to melt steel and evaporate a bog, yet one not so powerful as to get the best of Rudy. What Rudy had done with his magic here, he suspected would have taken the equivalent of 10 magicians or more. There were no ordinary magicians that could have defended the Hydra's attack like this. Rudy, as we know, wasn't ordinary though, but had the Hydra waited and used each head's dragon breath one after the other, a longer consecutive shot might have been more of a struggle for him. Rudy didn't understand why it didn't, but what he did know was that once they were done, they couldn't use it again. It wasn't possible for the same head to fire dragon's breath in quick succession like that. So it was after this that Rudy would start to think that they'd won, but right as he was cauterizing the second to last head, once again the Hydra would do something different. It would flail its severed heads as if they were whips, a last-ditch move that was clearly the result of being driven into a corner. Rudy's eye of foresight made it clear that this was what was coming, but because he was so close to the Hydra's body, he couldn't understand what exactly it was doing. He was unable to comprehend the spiked weapons of destruction flying straight towards him. Paul, on the other hand, knew this was exactly what was coming, so he was completely focused while Rudy was not. In fact, he was so confident in the experience of everyone around him that he completely forgot Rudy was still a rookie in the labyrinth. Whereas him, Talhand, and Alina Lise knew to avoid this one last attack, Rudy simply didn't, and that's how he was caught. It was a lack of experience that unfortunately proved to be fatal. That's when Rudy would finish the job with Stone Cannon, but not without costing him his arm first. You see, since the Hydra's scales covered its eyelids too, just the act of blinking sliced straight through him. The rest was the Hydra's muscles snapping his bone apart. It was once Rudy came to his senses after this that his playback of what happened revealed why Paul got hit. Long story short, it was essentially a matter of Paul being too skilled. You see, a kick this strong would have sent any normal person reeling back from the recoil. Because Paul was someone who could fight with battle aura though, the recoil, which should have moved his own body out of the way too, was no longer present and instead kept him stationary. It had made it so where Rudy was before was exactly where he ended up. Now, as for what Paul thought about all this, his only thought was to save Rudy. The moment he saw Rudy was in trouble, his reaction was immediate and without any thought for what came next. The rest was him taking in the aftermath, but right as he would try and ask for healing too, his inability to do so combined with the looks on everyone's faces revealed the somber fact that he was dying. Now, here's where I'd usually go over what his last thoughts were too, but the CD drama does such a great job conveying them that I'm just gonna go ahead and play that instead.
俺は死ぬのか。せめてゼニスが生きてるかどうかだけでも確認したかったな。それだけじゃねえ。ノルンやアイシャにもまた会いたかった。学校通ってんだっけか。大きくなったかな。リーレはどんな顔すっかな。迷惑ばっかかけたけど泣いてくれっかな。ちくしょう、未練だらけだ。死にたくねえ。まだやりたいことたくさんあるのによ。父さん。でもまあいっか。ルディが死ぬよりはよ。元気でな。
Episode 47, Let's Go Home, covering chapters 10 to 13 from volume 12 of the light novel. I'm gonna start things off from right after the Hydra fight since it's from here that the anime sped things up a bit. What I mean is that we pretty much went from one tragedy right into the next without really highlighting how much time had passed between them. With the time it took to escape the labyrinth as well as the time it took to get back to the city, there were actually several days in which Rudy got to contemplate Paul's death. The journey itself was very sloppy, but no matter how many mistakes Rudy made along the way, not one person complained or even spoke to him. It seemed there weren't really any words that anyone wanted to say right now. It was thanks to Roxy that Rudy was even able to make it out though, since without her right behind him guiding his movements, it was very likely he would have stepped on a teleportation trap. Luckily he didn't, so aside from a few relatively intense battles, their party was able to make it out unscathed. Now, the first night back was one of the most important since the dream he had where he sees his parents introduces that additional layer of grief I mentioned at the beginning of the video. It's the first part of a much longer self-reflection we should have seen later, one that uncovers an absolutely essential piece of Rudy's character development. So, the dream was actually a memory from Rudy's past life, and it brings to light the long-forgotten question of what was the relationship with his parents like. Like, we've seen them trying to support his recovery the best way they could, but if they were truly supportive all the way to the end, then why was it that Rudy didn't go to their funeral? This was the question Rudy was contemplating himself, and it brought with it all sorts of thoughts like how did they die and what did they think about him when they died. That's right, Rudy was so isolated in the world he'd confined himself to that he didn't even know what it was that killed his parents. This made him wonder if they were perhaps ashamed or angry at him, but just like the way they died, so too were their final thoughts of him a mystery. In the end, he had no idea how they truly felt about him anymore. Perhaps he didn't even cross their mind when they died. As for how Rudy felt when it happened, well, at the time he honestly didn't feel anything. To quote his own words from the novel, he didn't love them enough to grieve their absence. He was less concerned about having lost them and more worried by the thoughts of how he was going to live now. Combine this with his fear of how people perceived this, and what you get is the core reason for why he didn't attend their funeral. You see, Rudy was afraid of the way people looked at him when they saw he wasn't sad about his parents. He was scared of the hostility and contempt he knew he'd be confronted by. So, just like how he'd done for the majority of his life, he decided to avoid it the best way he knew how. As much as Rudy knew this type of behavior wasn't acceptable, he honestly just couldn't help but act this way. Reason being that, for him, his parents dying was the equivalent of losing his last source of salvation. It was kind of like being tossed into the ocean without taking a breath first. Yes, Rudy knew that this was selfish, but when you've lived a life as dependent as his, to lose it all suddenly was more than enough to make him want to escape reality. It was simply too much for him to handle at the time. That's not me trying to make excuses for him, but is instead just how Rudy perceived it all himself. He was well aware he should have done more and tried a little bit harder. In fact, after seeing Paul's face the way it was when he died, the regret of not seeing his own parents' faces were now starting to resurface. He truly wished he could go back in time and see how it was that they looked. This was a deeply rooted trauma Rudy didn't even know he was carrying, and as you'll soon see, it ties heavily into the depraved state we see him in later. Before that though, Rudy first has to find out about Zenith. It was the day after that distressing dream with his parents, and Rudy was overcome by an intense desire to do nothing. It took all he could to get up and do something, since as much as he wanted to crawl back into bed, the urge to do anything was even stronger. So that something was watching over Zenith, and what Rudy initially felt as momentary relief quickly turned to distraught as everything who was Zenith was missing. Her memory, knowledge, and intelligence was all gone. This hit harder than you might expect, since while yes, Rudy was distant from Zenith as he mentioned last episode, there was a bit of reassurance that came from knowing he could share Paul's death with her. As the embodiment of Paul's hopes and struggles, if anyone was gonna understand the grief that Rudy was going through, Zenith would be the one to share it with. The moment Rudy realized he wouldn't be able to, that's when his heart shattered and reality collapsed. Not only was everything everyone worked towards for naught, but whatever solace Rudy thought he could find was gone now. It had instantly sent Rudy straight into the depths of despair. Days would then pass without Rudy so much as leaving his bed, and his time would be spent in an endless loop of sleeping and waking up. When asleep, he would dream the final moments right before Paul's death, then when awake he would contemplate who he was to him. As much as he wanted to get up and do something, Rudy simply didn't have the willpower to follow through on it. Instead, he just lay in bed thinking about who it was he'd just lost in his life. So, to understand more about what Rudy thought about Paul, by most standards, he was a complete failure as a father. He wasn't the best example for any child, but even so, Rudy still loved him anyway. Not the way a child usually loved a parent, but rather as someone who Rudy felt he could relate to. He was more so a partner in crime or someone on even footing with him. It's because of that he could never truly see Paul as his father, but that didn't matter since Paul saw Rudy as his child. No matter how bizarre his behavior was growing up, Paul never once thought of Rudy as anything but family. Sure, there were times when he should have acted different, but in each and every interaction he'd ever had with him, Rudy was and forever will be Paul's son. He was a true father all the way through. Whether it be by carrying burdens far too heavy for himself or by literally shielding Rudy from certain death, Paul lived his life the way that every dedicated father would. So, just like how Rudy said in the anime, he wasn't Paul's child, but Paul was most certainly still his father. Sadness bubbled as Rudy considered the true family he was leaving behind, and that led to tears which came as a shock to him. What I mean is that not once did Rudy cry when his real parents died, yet here he was not able to hold himself back. These tears were flowing naturally for someone he didn't even consider his real parent. This may have been strange in the moment, but in time it made it clear Paul was every bit apparent to Rudy as the ones from his past life. So the more Rudy thought about the person Paul was, the more he would cry until the point of exhaustion. He would then sleep and dream of those horrifying moments, then repeat the process and do it all over again. Time slipped by as Rudy lay in bed, barely doing anything. Alina Lise and Lilia would occasionally check up on him, but because he was so engrossed in his own distraught, they might as well have been speaking an entirely different language. Rudy's brain simply couldn't comprehend them. Even if it could, it's not like he would have replied anyway since he just didn't have words to say. Rudy would then wonder if there was a way he could have saved Paul, but that only brought with it countless regrets for not having done things differently. Like, if they had just left, planned a bit more, then came back later, surely Paul would be alive and the outcome better. Rudy knew it was far too late for that though, so instead he simply had to accept that Paul was dead. Just like his parents from his past life, he needed to understand that he'd never see them again. No matter what he did or what he said, both them and Paul were now gone forever. This brings us now to a cutscene with Roxy, since while Rudy was spending the day swallowing in grief, Roxy was actively trying to figure out a way to help him. It's the missing context explaining how she was able to make the bold step we saw in the anime. So, she was at a pub with Geese, Tallhand, and Alina Lise, and the four of them were trying to figure out what to do. Initially with Zenith, then with Rudy. The topic of Zenith was particularly troubling since the state she was in was tougher to accept than death. You see, whereas death was something every adventurer was always ready to accept, Zenith's condition was something worse. It was an affliction of the mind that everyone knew to be unrecoverable. Unlike physical injuries which could always be healed with magic, a broken mind couldn't be restored no matter how powerful the healing was. Not even the divine tear could help those affected by it. This made Zenith's case more of a lost cause than anything, so instead the group decided to focus on who they could help right now. Specifically Rudy and his ever-deteriorating conditions. He hadn't eaten since the day Paul died, and he was barely drinking more than the required minimum. It was a terrible state that only worsened the longer it went on for. In fact, at the rate Rudy was going, there was a good chance he would be joining Paul soon. Thus the reason why everyone had gathered to discuss it. So, the best solution was determined to have someone sleep with him, but the main problem was figuring out who. The obvious choice was of course Alina Lise, but given her circumstances, she obviously couldn't. No one present knew what those circumstances were, so that's when Alina Lise had to explain everything to them. It was a conversation that would finally reveal Rudy's marriage to Roxy. A significant shock that only more alcohol could help her cope with. Part of the reason she was so taken aback by it was because there was a whole lot of embarrassment that came when remembering how she acted in the labyrinth. As we all saw in the last episodes, all those advances she made now made her feel foolish. She was mortified by the thought of having done all that and upset at the fact that no one told her sooner. Roxy chose not to say anything about it though, since what mattered most now was simply helping Rudy. A predicament the others ultimately decided to let Rudy sort out himself. Since Alina Lise couldn't do it and a brothel wouldn't be effective enough, in the end they all agreed Rudy would pick himself up on his own. He was after all an adult now, and more than that, he was Paul's son. So, as everyone agreed Rudy could figure it out, Roxy alone knew that he couldn't. It was a deeper understanding of Rudy that only came from the time she spent with him when she was younger. Before I talk more deeply on that though, it's important to understand why it is the others came to that conclusion so quickly. Long story short, Tallhand Geese and Alina Lise were all tired. It had been 6 long years since the displacement incident, and all 3 had been working non-stop since. Whether it be traveling continent to continent or delving the labyrinth, their once broken party had reunited under a common goal again. They'd even reconciled their differences and fought side by side, which was the shining beacon in an otherwise unpleasant situation. It was a turn of events that none had ever even dreamed would happen. All that was left was to rescue Zenith and find Ghislaine, then their original party could enjoy drinks like how they used to. This was what everyone thought to be the natural outcome of this all. Now that Paul was dead though, whatever hopes each had in making that distant dream come true were now shattered and out of reach. It was a sudden tragedy that overwhelmed each of them with this indescribable feeling of exhaustion. It wasn't so much from the fact that Paul had died though, but rather from the feeling everything had been for naught. It was as if they'd spent years building something special, all for it to fall to pieces right before completing it. Kinda like spending all day on a report then losing it because you didn't save it. This was what the others were going through, and it made it clear Rudy wasn't the only one feeling the fatigue of it all. This brings us now to Roxy and Rudius, which on a surface level showed what it was that needed to be shown. What the anime left out that was extremely important though was the clear-cut moment indicating Rudy's grief wasn't just about Paul. It was very much associated with his original parents too. Before he straight up says how this is though, Rudy would first explain how he was repeating the same mistakes as last time. Just like how he'd been unable to give anything back to his parents before, once again he felt he'd done the same with Paul and Zenith. He'd ignored their problems and kept to himself, and only realized the true effects of it when it was far too late. That marked 50 years he'd lived in total, yet none which were spent actually growing. To him, Rudy felt he hadn't changed at all. It was a revelation that spit right in the face of everything he set out to do in this life. So, feeling as if he'd wasted his years yet again, Rudy felt recovering this time was impossible. That is, at least until Roxy came and lightened his burden a bit. Her heartbeat and smell were oddly soothing, and knowing she herself lost a friend the same way Rudy lost Paul, well, that was reassuring since it showed it was possible to bounce back from these types of things. Roxy would then frame her advances as if they were for her, likely to make Rudy think that doing what they were going to do would be okay. She made clear that it was helping her get over Paul too, and that at most this was a casual one-time thing to wash away all the bad. This didn't really make any sense to Rudy, but for some reason he still found himself invested in it, enough that he wanted to explore more. The relief Roxy was offering was just too tempting to give up right now. It's the day after that brings us to what I think is the most important part of this whole season, because the topics covered here add a whole nother layer we've completely forgotten about Rudy. The anime did it back when he was dealing with Norn, but removed it here now in this scene with Roxy. It's the final part showing Rudy come to terms with how he treated his old family. An essential part of him accepting who he was before and finally moving on so that he can focus on his new family. So, the day after, Rudy did still feel an overbearing heaviness, but it wasn't the same despair he'd felt before. No, the anguish of yesterday felt like nothing but a dream now. He certainly felt lighter what with experiencing what he did, but to say it fixed everything wouldn't be accurate. It was more so just an effective means of temporary alleviation. What worked to help him more than that was actually Roxy's response to his question of what he should do now. It was an important question prefaced by an even more important story, one we unfortunately didn't get to see in the anime. So, before Rudy had asked what he did, he first spoke of his past life under the pretext it was a story he just made up. He referenced his trauma, the ensuing seclusion, and everything after, focusing mostly on the parts with his parents. You see, he wanted to make clear the part where he wasted away his old life, so the pain of repeating that same mistake was apparent in this new one. He explained how his old parents died and he didn't see them off, then paralleled that to Paul's death and how it made him see things differently. What I mean is that it was only after losing someone precious in this new life that Rudy was finally able to recall the death of his old parents and finally mourn them. A story Rudy gave to Roxy without including himself, but the message was clear and this was how Rudy was truly feeling. He was finally coming to terms with how it was he left his family in his old life and seeing for the first time just how much it really weighed on him. As Rudy described it himself, it was like the pent-up bile festering in his heart was all spilling out now. An emotional burden he was dying to finally let out to someone. So, all this was never just about Paul, but instead about his original parents too. It was an additional layer that makes the context of his question entirely different. Rather than what he should do as someone grieving Paul, it's now what should he do as someone who never reconciled with his old parents. This was what Rudy was truly asking here. It made Roxy's response slightly different since at first she suggested visiting his parents' graves and seeing the family that kicked him out. When Rudy explained how that wasn't possible, that's when she said how he should cherish the family in front of him now. It was an incredibly cliché response for sure, yet one strong enough to relieve Rudy of everything. Hearing her say these basic yet meaningful words reminded Rudy that both his parents and Paul's deaths were inevitable. It allowed him to understand that all he could do was face them head on and accept them. The bare minimum as someone still living. Yes, he did feel anxious about having to relay Paul's death to his sisters, but that was just one of many anxieties in a future full of unknowns. A future Rudy knew he couldn't run away from. If he was gonna keep pushing forward like how Paul would have wanted him to, then the only thing he could do now was solve the problems in front of him. He didn't know what he should do or how exactly to proceed, but what he could do was approach each issue and work his best to solve them. This was what he'd decided to do when he was reborn here, and it's once again something he'd recommitted to doing now. He had reaffirmed with himself his principle of living life to the fullest. This meant he would no longer turn his eyes away, so no matter what the problem, he vowed to always overcome them. It was a renewed mindset that freed Rudy from the shackles previously restraining him. A beacon of light shone in the darkness by Roxy. Because she was able to help him see what was really important, not only was Rudy able to deal with Paul's death in a way that was healthy, but he was also able to finally accept and overcome this suppressed emotional burden from his past life. It's some extra depth to Rudy's character that I personally thought to be very important. Now, the rest of the episode was the journey home, but rather than talk about the crazy money they made or Rudy's soft spot for Armadillo, instead I just want to talk briefly on Roxy's perspective here. Almost a month had passed where she was acting as both Rudy's left hand and his lover, so Rudy was trying to figure out a way to make things right. He wanted to repay Roxy for saving him since the way she had was on par with the way that Sylphie did. She was a source of mental support unlike any that Rudy had ever had before. Even if you consider all the things she had done before all this, Roxy's role in his life has had an immeasurable impact on him. Enough that Rudy knew he owed her more than anyone. So, Roxy would take this chance to explain her side of things, and specifically how she knew Rudy wouldn't be able to recover on his own. You see, she remembered just how close Rudy was to Paul back then. She also remembered just how terrified Rudy was when he went outside, and this reminded Roxy that despite all of Rudy's talent, deep down he was actually really weak. She recognized a part of Rudy that no one else ever could and used it to understand that Paul meant far more to him than anyone had even realized. Perhaps more than even Rudy himself. So, now that Paul was gone, Roxy was afraid Rudy would sink so far into depression that he wouldn't recover. She was afraid that leaving him for too long would only make things worse. This led her to actively try and find a solution, but since no one else could provide the one that she knew would work, Roxy concluded that it had to be her. She came to realize that she was the only one who could do this. The reason why she got so emotional after this was because in that brief moment where she shared such a deep intimacy with Rudy, she couldn't help but think that maybe she did have a chance. As illogical as it was to think that, Roxy's feelings for Rudy were something she simply couldn't contain anymore. What made the whole thing especially heart-wrenching was the fact that everyone knew Roxy had feelings for Rudy, yet no one did anything to tell her her efforts were futile. No, Instead, everyone just let them build and build to the point that she couldn't suppress them anymore, only for them to end up shattered in a conversation which should have happened sooner. To Roxy, this was both cruel and unfair, and while she would never voice how she felt to any of the others, in truth she was deeply hurt by how it happened. It was a devastating heartbreak that Rudy couldn't help but feel partially responsible for. The rest was the journey to the ruins, then the forest after, which for the most part captured the main things just fine. There was one big bombshell I'm surprised they didn't include, but that's something I'm sure they'll mention either next episode or next season. Just in case they don't though, I'll give you 5 seconds to click off the video, then I'll just go ahead and say what it was that was said. Okay, so in this conversation with Alina Lise, part of the reason both her and Rudy had such a change of heart was the potential that Roxy was, well, pregnant. Details had come out during a conversation between just Alina Lise and Roxy, and Alina Lise was now sharing those details with Rudy. This was what prompted Rudy to say he'd marry Roxy, and that's what led to their conversation after. Episode 48, Succession, covering chapters 13 to 16 from volume 12 of the light novel. Whereas the anime starts right with Rudy's arrival, the journey getting here had actually taken him 10 days. It was ample time for Rudy to consider the promise he'd just committed to, as well as contemplate the experience he was now returning from. Part of this included informing Lilia about his decision, which to her wasn't surprising at all. She readily accepted it without any judgment whatsoever. This was because monogamous marriage only existed in Millis, so convincing her wasn't going to be a problem. No, what was trying to explain things to Norn. Of course, Sylphie was the most important, but if anyone was gonna put up a fuss right from the get-go, Rudy knew Norn would react the worst. It was one of the problems he knew he couldn't run away from, despite knowing how angry she'd get. Because of his renewed conviction to continue forward, facing Norn was something he simply had to do. It was all part of living with no regrets again. It was once that word had popped into his mind that's when Rudy would contemplate the man-god's words again. A foreboding message he believed hadn't come to fruition yet, since what he felt now wasn't regret but instead sadness. Anxiety then bubbled for the remaining days he was traveling, so by the time he had made it back to the city, he was just about ready to burst from the anticipation of it all. It's the reason he started to sprint and leave everyone behind. Now, the anime had added quite a bit of drama to this because, for one, Rudy didn't fall flat on his face, and for another, Aisha was right there as soon as he entered. There wasn't that build-up making you think perhaps something did happen. There was a moment where Rudy was about to fall though, but because Alina Lise's a real one through and through, she was right there next to him to catch him. She had run alongside Rudy all the way to the house, then provided much needed composure to someone who was clearly panicking. It's not too important since it doesn't really change anything, but it does show a part of Alina Lise I've actually grown quite fond of. As for Rudy's misplaced regrets, it turns out they were just referring to the deaths of Paul and his old parents. The rest of his anxiety was thankfully unnecessary. Now, it was once home that Rudy would get the chance to talk to Sylphie first, since in the time it took for Aisha to get Norn from school, the two were able to catch up privately. It was a conversation which basically gave us a small update on what happened here. There wasn't anything particularly noteworthy, but there was this one incident at school that Nanahoshi took care of. A rather peculiar development since she usually kept to herself. Aside from that, Aisha's hobby of gardening was flourishing, Norn somehow became something like an idol and now has her own fan club, Zaniba, Cliff, Linnea, and Persenna all made their occasional checkups, Ariel was upset that Rudy didn't even tell her he was leaving, then Bodygotti was still missing and unaccounted for. It was fairly standard stuff for the 4 months he'd been away from everyone. Sylphie would then ask what happened to Rudy, but after seeing everyone's faces and the absence of Paul, it didn't take long for her to come to her own conclusions. Greeting Zenith only reaffirmed her assumption, and it made clear the ensuing conversation wasn't going to be as happy as she thought it was. What she initially perceived as Zenith simply disapproving of their marriage was instead shown to be something worse. Now, Norn and Aisha's return was first prefaced by a round of tea, which, as you'd expect, was heavily scrutinized by Lilia. Since this was what she trained Aisha to do, it was only natural she was judging to see whether her daughter was capable or not. This included gathering the luggage, hanging people's coats, and drying their shoes. all of which was done impeccably and to Lilia's satisfaction. It was decent work that only warranted a light reminder of why it is Aisha does all this. This was a comment Rudy found to be a little bit weird, since considering both hadn't seen each other in years, you'd think they'd act a little more warm to each other. Instead, Lilia was more in teacher mode, so perhaps this was just her showing restraint. They were about to have quite the serious conversation after all. The conversation itself wasn't particularly different, but both Rudy and Norn were a lot more blunt with what they said to each other. Rudy just straight up stated that Paul had died, and Norn rebutted by confirming Rudy couldn't save either of their parents. Of course, she was angry and upset, but she wasn't so immature as to not hear what Rudy had to say first. So, after a summary of the tragedy and a waterfall of tears, Norn would quickly accept that this was just the outcome, then immediately look forward in a way that Rudy could only be envious of. Whereas he confined himself and required saving, not only did Norn face Paul's death head on, but she did so instantly and all by herself. She didn't blame Rudy or the world or herself, but instead accepted that this was how things were and continued forward. That's not to say she wasn't feeling grief, but she certainly wasn't feeling that same level of regret like how Rudy did. No, Norn understood that nothing could be done about it, and in the process displayed yet another incredible feat of emotional maturity. To Rudy, she was truly strong in her own way. This was further exemplified when she alone understood the feelings Aisha was holding back, since what Rudy mistook for Aisha trying to be distant from Lilia, Norn recognized as Aisha showing restraint. One glance was all it took for Norn to understand Aisha's true emotions here. Now, we saw Norn take Paul's longsword after this, but what we didn't see was how Aisha took his other one. This ultimately left Rudy with nothing, since while he was supposed to get Paul's armor, Zenith subconsciously took that for herself. It was an outcome Rudy was surprisingly okay with, since to him, Paul had given him so much already. Rudy would then go on to explain Zenith's condition, which was just as much a mystery now as it was before. He wasn't certain nothing could be done about it, but with the way everyone else spoke, they all made it seem like chances of recovery were slim. Like, if healing magic wasn't good enough and the current medical technology too primitive to examine her brain, any sort of recovery just seemed unrealistic right now. Perhaps inflicting the same level of shock would have her memories snap back, but that wasn't something Rudy was willing to experiment. Besides, Rudy wasn't even sure she'd be happy if she got her memories back anyway. He knew it wasn't right to assume that though, so at the very least they had to try and do something, the minimum of which was to find some proper care and treatment for her. It was after this that everyone would say their goodbyes, and through that, give a little insight as to what some were gonna do next. Geese and Tallhand were planning to return to adventuring, while Vieira and Shiera were gonna go back to Asura. Apparently there were still people from the search and rescue squad they were indebted to, so that's who they were gonna go help out next. This reminded Rudy that Zenith's family had actually been financing Paul's activities, so if anything he at least needed to send them a letter. Sure, Zenith wasn't in the best condition, but they did deserve to know that she'd been found. Fast forward now to when only 5 were left, and aside from the egregious act of removing Dillo as their new household pet, the true carnage, so to say, was in Rudy's plea to Sylphie. As he recounted the extent of his betrayal, the longer it went on, the worse it got. Especially when he mentioned how he may have gotten Roxy pregnant. This brought up the whole notion of how he had to take responsibility, but was in actuality nothing but a lie. For those of you currently confused, last episode I mentioned how Alina Lise told Rudy that Roxy was pregnant. This was what spurred Rudy's rapid change of heart, and it made it easier to accept the idea of having 2 wives. Well, we don't find this out until a little bit after this fight, but that whole thing was just a story Alina Lise made up. She never had that type of conversation with Roxy, and Roxy never told her anything indicating that she was pregnant. As it turns out, Alina Lise just couldn't stand seeing Roxy be so sad, so she baited Rudy into thinking that he had to take care of her. It was a simple trap that worked exactly how she intended it to. A little white lie that simply sped up what was likely inevitable. So, Roxy isn't pregnant and she never was, but the notion she was a major part in things turning out this way. But anyway, it was Norn's outburst after that became quite the point of contention. We all saw just how obnoxious she was being, and to Rudy it was starting to become unacceptable. So much so that he almost got to the point of hitting her. He knew he wasn't in the right to do so, but if it meant putting a stop to this heinous Roxy slander, Rudy was just about ready to do so. Even if it meant making his sister hate him, if it prevented Roxy from leaving, then that was a sacrifice he was willing to make in that moment. Luckily, it didn't come to that, but that was the level of panic Rudy was dealing with when confronted with Roxy leaving like that. He was so desperate to make things right that he would do literally anything. That's when Sylphie would step up and set her straight instead, and the way she did was a lot more firm than the soft, kind words we saw her say in the anime. Whereas here she was being all nice and considerate, in the novel Sylphie straight up told Norn to stop. She had even scolded Norn for being too harsh. It was a more stern version of Sylphie I would have loved to see in the anime. This brings us now to why Sylphie was so understanding of everything, and in addition to all we saw her say already, there was an interesting caveat she mentioned for the scenario when Rudy did sleep with someone else. Sylphie knew that when he inevitably did, he would also be loyal enough to want to bring her into the family. Not once did Sylphie think she'd have Rudy to herself forever. The reason she was so surprised when the topic came up then was because she never expected it to happen during this trip here. She always figured it would be Linnea, Persena, or Nanahoshi, but completely forgot it could happen while away saving his parents. She was then so caught up in the tragedy that had befallen Rudy that it didn't even occur to her that he could have hooked up with someone. That's the reason why she was so visibly surprised when Rudy revealed it to her. It wasn't because he had brought another wife home, but rather because of the wild circumstances under which it happened. Only after thinking about it a little bit longer did Sylphie realize, yeah, this makes sense for Rudy. So, that's when the two would accept each other as equals and both agree to support Rudy together. Now, it's a bit later we find out Sylphie went into this conversation expecting the worst, so that was yet another reason for why she was so surprised by it. What she initially thought was Rudy getting ready to leave her was instead something far more manageable. Rudy, of course, wasn't ever gonna do that, but for some reason Sylphie had a feeling Rudy wasn't coming back to her. Consider it a very strong sense of foreboding. Sylphie, Roxy, and Rudy would then get the chance to talk in private, the majority of which was spent discussing how things would work from now on. They had decided Sylphie would get Rudy until she gave birth, and after that the two would split their time with him equally. This was an idea that came directly from Sylphie, since to monopolize Rudy wouldn't be fair to Roxy. There was also no telling when Rudy might come home with a third wife. Of course, Rudy had zero intention of doing so, but in the off chance he did, Sylphie knew her and Roxy needed to spend as much time as possible with him now. It was a notion Rudy fully exclaimed to be impossible so long as he wasn't depressed and confronted by a woman of Roxy's caliber again. As long as that specific situation never happened again, Rudy was convinced he wouldn't cheat ever. Well, for a second time. Fast forward to a scene where Dillo tried to hop in bed with Rudy and Sylphie, then after that would be the days following this. Their relationship was going stronger than ever, and Rudy had no problem loving both her and Roxy equally. He figured as long as he kept doing what he was doing, then maybe he could get by even with a third wife. Roxy now spent her days as a professor at the university, and it wasn't long before she'd been introduced to everyone. 1 month later was Sylphie's delivery, and aside from this being the third that Rudy has been a part of, there was a scene right after where Rudy would ask Roxy to do the same for him. He had essentially just witnessed the birth of his first child, then immediately went to Roxy and told her she was next. Some may consider this hopeless behavior, but to Rudy he was genuinely looking forward to it. It was all part of his resolve to living life to the fullest. Now, the part with Paul's grave just reaffirmed what it was he was living for, and it captured that message pretty much perfectly, much to the point that there's nothing for me to really add here. It was the anime simply reminding us what this story is all about, the portrayal of Rudy's continued journey forward. So that's that for Mushoku Tensei Season 2. For those of you that only watch my channel for this anime, I guess I'll see you back here when Season 3 comes out. Thanks again for watching my coverage of this, and if you want to support the channel then consider leaving a like and subscribing. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!